My son-in-law mocked me after knocking my plate down while making a toast at dinner in front of his senior colleagues and partners. He looked at me and said, "If you want dinner, lick it off the floor." I stood up, adjusted my coat, and said 5 words that left him completely terrified. The next day, I did something even worse. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. My name is Waylon Freeman, and I am 68 years old. I sat in the most exclusive French restaurant in the city, feeling the heavy, judgmental gazes of the men surrounding the table. Brent Gallagher, my son-in-law, was hosting a lavish victory dinner to celebrate securing a $10 million funding round for his new real estate technology startup. The private dining room smelled of expensive truffles and vintage wine. Brent sat at the head of the long table, flanked by wealthy partners in tailored Italian suits. I wore my old, faded navy blazer. Brent leaned across the table, swirling his wine glass, and pointed a manicured finger at me. He loudly mocked my cheap attire to his colleagues, making a passive-aggressive jab about how some men never rise above their station in life. He laughed while gesturing at my rough, calloused hands, telling his investors that I spent my life pushing brooms and hauling trash just to scrape by. Those men chuckled, completely unaware of the truth. My calluses were not from manual labor as a janitor. They were the permanent, hardened marks of spending 40 solid years building massive construction sites with my own bare hands. Those hands had poured concrete and laid steel long before I founded the multi-billion-dollar investment firm known as Apex Holdings. A sharp retort burned in my throat, ready to tear down his arrogant facade right then and there. I remained completely silent for one reason alone. I caught the eyes of my daughter Dominique. She sat beside Brent, casting me desperate, pleading looks across the fine linen tablecloth. She silently begged me not to cause a scene. I swallowed my heavy pride, gripped my white linen napkin very tightly, and simply stared blankly at my porcelain plate in total silence tonight to keep the peace. The main course was finally cleared away by the attentive waitstaff, leaving only half-empty wine glasses and an atmosphere thick with unearned arrogance. Brent pushed his chair back, stood up, and picked up his crystal champagne flute. He grabbed a silver spoon and deliberately clinked it against the delicate glass. The sharp ringing sound demanded absolute attention from everyone in the private dining space. The low murmur of wealthy conversation ceased immediately as all eyes turned to him. He basked in the spotlight, his chest puffed out with a sickening sense of self-importance. He began a grandiose speech about vision, determination, and the grueling path of a true self-made man. He paced back and forth at the head of the table, making wide, sweeping gestures with his free hand. He spoke at length about how he had built his real estate technology startup entirely from the ground up, claiming he never relied on anyone else for help. His investors nodded along, completely captivated by his charismatic performance. They drank in every word, believing they were backing a rare, brilliant prodigy. Then he turned his attention back to me. His charming smile twisted into a cruel, patronizing sneer. He gestured toward where I sat quietly. He told his colleagues that true success requires a special breed of intellect, something that cannot be taught to people who are satisfied with mediocrity. He loudly contrasted his multi-million-dollar valuation with my supposed lifetime of menial labor and total lack of ambition. He insisted that some men are born to conquer the corporate world, while others are destined to fade into the background, cleaning up the messes left by their superiors. Dominique flinched at his harsh words, visibly shrinking into her leather seat. She looked utterly humiliated, but remained paralyzed by his overwhelming influence over her life. Brent fed off her submission. He continued to pace the large room, soaking in the polite applause from his business partners. Every sentence he delivered was specifically designed to elevate himself by aggressively tearing me down. He wanted to assert dominance, to prove to his rich friends that he was the undeniable alpha of our family. He desperately wanted to break my spirit in front of an audience. I listened to his entire speech without blinking, letting him dig his own metaphorical grave much deeper with every arrogant syllable he spoke aloud tonight. Brent finished his long toast, taking a large sip of his expensive champagne. As he returned to his seat at the head of the table, he purposefully chose to walk closely behind my chair. He did not simply brush past me. He intentionally slammed his hip against the back of my wooden seat with aggressive force. The sudden jolt threw me entirely off balance. My arm jerked violently, striking the edge of my heavy porcelain plate. The beautifully plated piece of steak clattered onto the pristine marble floor, splattering dark brown gravy across the immaculate white tiles. The entire private dining room fell completely silent. The soft classical music playing in the background suddenly felt incredibly loud. The investors paused with their forks suspended halfway to their mouths, watching the scene unfold with morbid fascination. No one offered to call a waiter. No one offered to help me pick up the ruined meal. They just stared, waiting to see how the pathetic old man would react to such a blatant display of disrespect. Brent stopped walking and looked down at the mess near my feet. He let out a condescending sigh, adjusting the cuffs of his expensive suit. He smirked, his eyes filled with pure malice, and delivered his final insult clearly for the whole room to hear. "If you want dinner, lick it off the floor." A chorus of cruel laughter immediately erupted from his wealthy partners. They found his ruthless behavior utterly hilarious, joining in the mockery without a single ounce of hesitation. I slowly turned my gaze toward my daughter. Dominique lowered her head, staring intently at her lap. Her shoulders trembled slightly, but she remained completely silent, far too manipulated and terrified of her husband to defend her own father. Her silence was more painful than his words. I did not yell. I did not demand an apology. The time for warnings had officially passed. I calmly pushed my chair back and stood up to my full height. I carefully adjusted the lapels of my faded navy coat, maintaining absolute composure. The laughter in the room began to die down as my calm demeanor unsettled them. They expected a humiliated old man to cower. Instead, they watched a quiet, calculating force prepare to unleash absolute financial devastation upon their beloved golden boy very soon, and without any mercy whatsoever from me tonight for this blatant disrespect. The echo of the shattered porcelain and the wet thud of the meat hitting the floor lingered in the private dining room. Every eye remained fixed on me, waiting for the predictable reaction of a humiliated man. They expected a flushed face, a stammering apology, or perhaps a sudden outburst of futile, impotent rage. They expected the broken posture of an old man who finally understood his place at the bottom of the hierarchy. I gave them absolutely none of that. Instead of reacting to the chaos Brent had just orchestrated, I looked down at my worn navy blazer. A single drop of dark brown peppercorn gravy had splashed onto the lapel. I raised my hand and calmly brushed the stain away with slow, deliberate strokes of my thumb. The room watched this quiet display of self-control with growing unease. The wealthy investors exchanged confused glances, their previous cruel laughter entirely extinguished by the heavy, suffocating silence now dominating the space. Dominique sat frozen in her chair, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the edge of the fine linen tablecloth. She looked up at me with tears welling in her eyes, silently bracing herself for the humiliation to continue. I shifted my gaze away from my daughter and locked eyes directly with Brent. He stood at the head of the table with his crystal champagne flute still suspended in the air. The arrogant smirk on his face began to falter just slightly as he registered my complete lack of intimidation. I did not raise my voice to match the aggressive energy he had pumped into the room. I kept my tone perfectly level, letting the natural acoustics of the dining space carry my voice to every single person seated at the long table. I looked right through his expensive suit, right through his fabricated persona of a self-made tech genius, and dismantled his entire reality. I delivered exactly 5 simple words with the chilling precision of a judge reading a final and absolute verdict. I own the parent company. The syllables hung in the air, heavy and undeniable, carrying the weight of a storm about to break. I did not blink. I did not break eye contact. I let the raw, unfiltered truth settle over the room, watching the initial wave of confusion wash over the faces of the senior colleagues who had just mocked my very existence tonight. Brent stared at me for 3 long seconds before the sheer absurdity of my statement in his mind broke his paralysis. He burst into loud theatrical laughter, tossing his head back as if I had just delivered the punchline to a brilliant joke. The sudden noise broke the tension, giving his wealthy partners permission to breathe again. Brent quickly stepped forward, placing a patronizing hand on my shoulder while addressing the room with an exaggerated look of profound sympathy. He tapped the side of his head and smoothly explained to his investors that my mental faculties had been rapidly declining over the past year. He quickly spun a highly tragic tale on the spot, claiming I was suffering from early-stage dementia and frequently experienced severe delusions of grandeur. He apologized for my supposed confusion, assuring the men at the table that it was simply the tragic reality of an aging mind desperately clinging to a false sense of authority. A few of the executives nodded with patronizing understanding, their eyes shifting from amusement to thinly veiled pity. Dominique remained completely silent, staring at her hands while her husband publicly declared her father insane. The betrayal cut deep, but my expression never wavered. I refused to grant Brent the satisfaction of a verbal argument. An argument would require me to view him as an equal man, and he had just proven he was entirely beneath my contempt. I gently but firmly removed his hand from my shoulder, brushing the fabric of my coat as if his touch had left a foul residue. I did not attempt to correct his lies. I did not try to convince the room of my identity. I simply turned my back on the lavish table, the half-empty champagne glasses, and the cowardly silence of my own daughter. I walked straight toward the heavy wooden doors of the grand private dining room with slow, measured steps, my posture impeccably straight. The murmurs of the elite crowd resumed behind me, dismissing the crazy old man who had momentarily disrupted their celebration. I pushed the front doors of the restaurant open and stepped out into the freezing night air. The bitter wind hit my face instantly, a sharp contrast to the suffocating warmth of that room. I stood alone on the illuminated sidewalk, fully embracing the chilling temperature. The time for silent observation was officially over right now. The harsh winter wind bit at my face, a stark reminder of the harsh realities I had ignored for far too long. I stood under the flickering amber glow of a street lamp, letting the cold clear my mind of any lingering paternal guilt. The affection I held for my daughter had kept me docile, allowing a parasitic coward to feast on the massive empire I had built with my bare hands over the years. That foolish grace period was officially terminated tonight. I reached into the inner pocket of my worn blazer and pulled out a heavy matte black smartphone. It possessed no conventional applications, only a highly encrypted network connecting me directly to the central nervous system of Apex Holdings. I unlocked the screen using a secure biometric scan and dialed the direct line for Jonathan Reed, my lead corporate attorney and the only man who knew the full extent of my financial reach. The line rang exactly twice before Jonathan answered the call, his tone sharp and highly professional despite the late hour. I did not bother with trivial pleasantries. I spoke with the icy authority that had terrified real estate titans for decades. I instructed him to initiate the immediate cancellation of the funding agreement with Gallagher Innovations. Jonathan paused for a fraction of a second, entirely aware of the catastrophic damage this sudden action would undoubtedly inflict. He asked if I was absolutely certain about tearing down my own son-in-law. I confirmed the order without a single ounce of hesitation. I commanded him to activate Protocol Zero, a legally ironclad maneuver designed to instantly freeze capital injections in the event of severe moral turpitude or executive misconduct. The retaliation was no longer a theoretical threat. It was a live, irreversible execution. I stood on the pavement, watching the warm, golden light spilling from the windows of the restaurant where Brent was still toasting his non-existent genius. He believed he had conquered the world by stepping on an old man. He was a complete fraud, living on borrowed time, and his time had just expired. He had no idea the solid ground beneath his expensive Italian shoes was already crumbling into absolute dust. I ended the brief call and slipped the highly encrypted device back into my deep coat pocket. The silent correction had begun, and I fully intended to watch his stolen kingdom burn to ash. The freezing wind whipped down the empty avenue as I held the encrypted phone to my ear. Jonathan Reed did not ask redundant questions. He was a man who understood the weight of midnight phone calls and the absolute authority of the voice on the other end of the line. I stood under the flickering amber glow of the street lamp and delivered my instructions with mechanical precision. I told Jonathan to instantly void the $10 million capital injection approved for Gallagher Innovations earlier that afternoon. The wire transfer was scheduled to clear the Federal Reserve at dawn. I demanded he pull it back immediately. Jonathan tapped rapidly on his keyboard, the sound echoing softly through the secure connection. He pulled up the master agreement we had structured months prior. I instructed him to execute Section 4, Paragraph 9. It was a highly specific morality clause buried deep within the fine print of the funding contract. It stipulated that Apex Holdings reserved the absolute right to freeze, recall, or terminate all financial support if the founder exhibited behavior detrimental to the core ethical values of the parent company. Publicly humiliating a senior family member in a room full of industry executives easily satisfied that strict legal requirement. Brent had signed that contract blind, too arrogant and eager to read the binding conditions that governed his sudden influx of massive wealth. He thought he was entirely untouchable. He believed venture capital was free money handed out to men who wore the right suits and possessed the right amount of reckless confidence. Jonathan confirmed the clause was active and completely ready for execution. He verified the exact routing numbers and the precise sum of $10 million currently pending in the digital ether. I felt no remorse as I listened to my trusted lawyer prepare the financial guillotine. I felt only the cold, sharp clarity of a man reclaiming his stolen property. Brent had built his entire identity on the illusion of invincibility. I was about to strip away the armor he had purchased using my money. I ordered Jonathan to finalize the definitive reversal. I wanted the funds drained from Brent's corporate accounts before the sun came up over the city. I wanted his victory celebration to be the last comfortable night he would ever experience. The absolute gears of his total destruction were officially in motion now. Jonathan remained silent for a brief moment as the system processed the massive recall. The delay allowed my mind to briefly wander back to the countless family dinners where Brent had smugly held court. I clearly remembered him sitting at my dining table swirling a glass of my scotch, boasting loudly about his brilliant business acumen. He constantly bragged about securing funding from the legendary Apex Holdings entirely on his own merit. He would look down his nose at me, lecturing me on the complexities of modern venture capital and the sheer magnitude of his persuasive pitching skills. He claimed the board of directors at Apex had been utterly captivated by his revolutionary vision for real estate technology. He loved to emphasize how difficult it was for ordinary people to even get a meeting with such a prestigious financial institution. He spun elaborate tales of grueling negotiations and triumphant handshakes. The actual truth was far less glamorous. Brent never actually possessed the brilliant business mind he claimed to have. His startup was completely mediocre, bleeding cash and lacking any sustainable path to real profitability. He had been rejected by every single major investment firm in the city. The only reason Gallagher Innovations secured that initial seed money was because I personally intervened. I had quietly reviewed his pathetic financial portfolio and decided to grant him a lifeline solely for the sake of my daughter. I wanted Dominique to have a stable life, so I instructed my board to approve his funding application under strict anonymity. I became the invisible architect of his entire success. He never knew the anonymous board chairman who approved the seed money was the very same father-in-law he relentlessly belittled. I allowed him to take full credit. I allowed him to build his fragile ego on a foundation of my silent charity. I wore faded clothes and drove an old truck, letting him feel superior while I secretly funded his lavish lifestyle. His massive pride had blinded him to the obvious reality of his situation. He was a mediocre man standing on the shoulders of a giant he actively chose to humiliate. Now the giant was simply shifting his immense weight. By pulling back the $10 million, I was not ruining his business. I was now merely exposing the undeniable fact that his pathetic business never truly existed without my massive hidden money backing him. Jonathan's voice crackled through the encrypted speaker, pulling my thoughts away from the past and back to the freezing sidewalk. He warned me that initiating this aggressive reversal would not be a quiet administrative procedure. Freezing a $10 million capital transfer in the dead of night would immediately trigger a massive red alert across Brent's entire corporate banking ecosystem. The financial shockwave would automatically lock his operational accounts, freeze his credit lines, and send immediate panic signals to every secondary investor attached to his fragile startup. Jonathan wanted absolute confirmation before pulling the digital trigger that would undoubtedly obliterate the company by morning. I stared down the dark, empty street and gave him the final authorization without a single tremor in my voice. I told him to burn the bridge completely. I abruptly ended the call, turned my collar up against the biting winter chill, and walked slowly toward the local subway station. I felt a profound sense of tranquility wash over my tired bones. The long, agonizing years of holding my tongue to preserve a toxic peace were finally over. The morning sun eventually rose, painting the city skyline in brilliant shades of amber and pale blue. The harsh daylight brought the inevitable consequence of my midnight directive. I sat quietly in a small, unassuming retro diner on the edge of the financial district. I ordered my usual hot black coffee and a plate of scrambled eggs, watching the morning commuters rush past the large glass windows. I knew the storm was rapidly approaching my exact location. Right on cue, the heavy diner door swung open violently, the brass bell ringing with frantic urgency. Dominique stormed through the entrance, her designer coat unbuttoned and her face flushed with absolute panic and intense rage. Her eyes frantically scanned the crowded booths until she locked onto my calm figure sitting in the corner. She marched straight toward my table, her high heels clicking aggressively against the checkered linoleum floor. The waitstaff and nearby patrons turned their heads, sensing the immediate shift in the atmosphere. My daughter slammed her expensive leather handbag onto the table, rattling my coffee cup and saucer. She stood towering over me, breathing heavily, completely consumed by the chaotic narrative her desperate husband had undoubtedly spun for her during the early hours of the morning. The catastrophic financial fallout had officially arrived just as I had planned. Dominique stood over my table, her chest heaving as she glared down at me. She did not offer a greeting. She slammed her designer handbag down and immediately demanded that I stand up, get in my truck, and drive directly to Gallagher Innovations. She ordered me to apologize to Brent in front of his entire executive team. Her voice was shrill, completely devoid of the respect she once held for me. She claimed my behavior the previous night was an absolute disgrace. According to her, Brent was incredibly gracious to excuse my outburst as a symptom of early-stage dementia. He had spent the entire morning convincing her that my mind was rapidly deteriorating. He spun a pathetic narrative painting himself as the victim of a confused, aggressive old man. He told her my actions nearly cost him the $10 million funding round. Dominique bought every single lie he fed her. She accused me of trying to sabotage her husband out of sheer jealousy because I could not handle seeing a younger man achieve success. She believed I was losing my grip on reality. The gaslighting was absolute. Brent had successfully twisted the narrative, transforming his malicious bullying into a tragic story of a senior citizen losing his faculties. He used her fear of my aging against me. Dominique demanded I drop my foolish pride and make amends before Brent decided to cut me out of their lives completely. She warned me that Brent was seriously considering an emergency medical conservatorship if I refused to cooperate. He had convinced her that I was a danger to myself and his corporate reputation. She leaned closer, her eyes flashing with a mix of anger and misplaced pity. She told me to stop pretending I was some powerful corporate giant and accept that I was just a retired construction worker losing his memory. Her words were designed to hurt, fueled entirely by the poison her husband had poured into her ear. I listened to her vicious tirade without interrupting. I remained completely silent during her rant. I watched the daughter I raised transform into a mouthpiece for a corporate parasite. She was entirely blind to the reality of the situation, fiercely protecting the exact man who was actively destroying her future. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee, letting the bitter taste match the reality of her profound delusion. The scene violently shifted from the quiet suburban diner to the towering heights of the downtown financial district. Brent sat behind a massive desk of imported Italian marble inside the sleek, floor-to-ceiling glass walls of Gallagher Innovations. He was completely insulated from the freezing wind outside, leaning back in his ergonomic leather chair while admiring the panoramic view of the skyline. He was already rehearsing the arrogant, self-congratulatory press release he planned to issue regarding his newly acquired $10 million capital injection. He believed he was entirely untouchable. He believed he had finally secured his permanent place among the city's corporate elite. His manufactured tranquility shattered instantly. The heavy glass door to his private office was thrown open with violent force. His lead accountant, a usually composed and meticulous man, burst into the room sweating profusely. The accountant completely ignored all standard corporate protocols, breathing heavily as he slapped a bright red financial printout directly onto Brent's immaculate desk. He did not bother to sit down. He delivered the catastrophic news with a voice cracking from sheer panic. Every single corporate account under the Gallagher Innovations umbrella was completely locked down tight. The operational funds were frozen solid. The payroll distribution was permanently halted. The credit lines were instantly suspended by their primary banking institution. Brent bolted upright, his face twisting in sudden confusion. He aggressively demanded a coherent explanation, shouting that the Apex Holdings wire transfer was fully guaranteed to clear the Federal Reserve by dawn. The accountant shook his head frantically, pointing a trembling finger at the final line of the red document. The $10 million capital injection had not cleared. The entire transaction had been officially and forcefully reversed by the parent company at exactly 3 o'clock in the morning. The funds had vanished from their ledger without a single warning notification or administrative alert whatsoever. The accountant stated clearly that the bank was already initiating automated penalty protocols for their suddenly overdrawn accounts. Brent stared blindly at the cold, stark numbers printed on the thick paper. The massive fortune he had toasted to just 12 hours earlier was completely gone. His entire business empire was currently operating on empty fumes, completely insolvent and actively bleeding precious cash by the very second. The brutal reality of the situation crashed down on him like a massive concrete pillar. His arrogant startup was completely dead right now. Brent aggressively grabbed his sleek silver laptop and hurled it violently across the spacious office. The highly expensive machine smashed against the reinforced glass wall, shattering into dozens of sharp plastic and metal pieces that rained down onto the pristine carpet. He screamed loudly at the accountant to get out of his sight immediately. The terrified man sprinted from the room, pulling the heavy door shut behind him. Brent paced behind his desk like a caged animal, his breathing ragged and shallow. He unbuttoned his custom suit jacket and ripped his silk tie from his neck. His mind raced frantically, trying to calculate how this impossible disaster had occurred. He had spent the last 3 years meticulously cultivating an image of absolute success, all built entirely on a foundation of calculated manipulation and deceit. He had never truly loved Dominique. He married her 3 years ago for one specific and highly calculated reason. He had thoroughly and systematically researched her family background and discovered that her father owned a massive plot of prime, undeveloped suburban land. That single piece of real estate was perfectly zoned for a highly lucrative commercial development project. Brent believed the land was the old man's only valuable asset in the entire world. He assumed I was just a tired, worn-out construction worker sitting on a gold mine he was too stupid to develop. He played the part of the devoted, loving boyfriend perfectly. He charmed Dominique, isolated her from her independent friends, and slowly alienated her from my influence. He was entirely convinced that by legally binding himself to my only daughter, he would automatically inherit the land when I inevitably passed away. He viewed me as nothing more than a stubborn obstacle holding up his future real estate empire. He tolerated my presence at family gatherings strictly as a necessary chore. He smiled through gritted teeth while silently counting the days until he could bulldoze my modest suburban home and pave over the soil. The Apex Holdings seed money was supposed to be the bridge loan that sustained his extravagant lifestyle until he finally secured my valuable property. Now the seed money was absolutely gone. The bank accounts were frozen solid. The carefully constructed facade was collapsing around him with terrifying speed. The deeply arrogant plan to permanently steal an old man's entire family legacy had suddenly turned into an unmitigated corporate nightmare today. Brent slammed his clenched fists onto his imported mahogany desk, refusing to accept defeat. He smashed the intercom button and aggressively ordered his executive assistant to get the chief executive officer of Apex Holdings on the direct line immediately. He barked that this was clearly an administrative error, a catastrophic mistake made by some low-level accounting clerk who lacked the proper authorization. He paced the room forcefully, smoothing down his hair and adjusting his collar, desperately trying to regain his shattered composure. He desperately convinced himself he could easily smooth-talk his way out of this temporary setback. 5 agonizing minutes dragged by in total silence. The intercom finally buzzed. Brent snatched the receiver, ready to unleash a torrent of arrogant corporate jargon. But it was not the chief executive on the other end of the line. His young assistant stepped slowly into the private office. She was visibly trembling, clutching a thick document printed on heavy cream-colored stationery. She held it out to him with shaking hands, keeping her eyes firmly planted on the floor. She quietly explained that Apex Holdings flatly refused to take his phone call. Instead, a strict corporate courier had just hand-delivered this highly sensitive envelope directly to the front reception desk. Brent snatched the thick paper from her grasp and tore it open. His arrogant confidence evaporated entirely as he rapidly scanned the bold black text. It was a formal, legally binding corporate summons. The document explicitly cited a direct and egregious breach of the morality clause hidden deep within his funding contract. The stark legal language offered absolutely no room for negotiation or debate. The wire transfer reversal was entirely intentional and permanent. The final closing paragraph contained a strict, severe, non-negotiable ultimatum. Brent was legally compelled to appear at the towering Apex Holdings headquarters at exactly 2 o'clock this afternoon. He was summoned to personally explain his blatant contractual violations directly to the anonymous board chairman. Failure to appear would result in the immediate and aggressive liquidation of Gallagher Innovations. His assistant quickly backed out of the room, leaving him standing entirely alone in the wreckage of his shattered ego. He stared blindly at the imposing document, cold sweat forming on his brow. The invisible giant he had unknowingly mocked was finally summoning him to the ultimate reckoning. He was blindly walking straight into a meticulously crafted trap today. Brent arrived at the towering glass and steel monolith of Apex Holdings headquarters exactly 15 minutes early. He frantically bypassed the valet, sprinting through the revolving doors while furiously wiping a sheen of cold sweat from his forehead. His custom-tailored Italian suit, usually a source of immense arrogant pride, now felt like a suffocating straitjacket against his skin. The receptionist in the cavernous marble lobby barely glanced at him. She checked his name off a pristine digital ledger and silently gestured for a towering security guard to escort him upward. The silent elevator ride to the executive penthouse level felt agonizingly slow. Brent desperately practiced his smooth apologies and aggressive counter-arguments in his head. The elevator chimed softly. The guard led him down a long, immaculate corridor and pushed open a set of heavy oak doors, gesturing for Brent to enter. Brent stepped into a massive boardroom. The walls were lined with dark mahogany and enormous windows overlooking the sprawling financial district below. The guard firmly shut the doors behind him, the heavy click of the latch echoing loudly in the absolute silence. The room was unnervingly pristine and completely empty. Brent took a seat near the center of the massive polished conference table, eagerly waiting for the elusive chairman to make a grand entrance. 10 minutes passed, then 30, then a full hour. The ambient temperature in the room was aggressively cold, the industrial air conditioning deliberately set to a freezing temperature. Brent shivered, crossing his arms tightly across his chest as the icy air pierced right through his expensive wool suit. He checked his luxury watch for the 50th time. 2 hours dragged by in total isolation. There was no water offered. There was no administrative assistant popping in to apologize for the delay. The psychological torture was entirely intentional and flawlessly executed. The oppressive silence and the freezing temperature were meticulously designed to completely break his inflated ego before a single word was ever spoken. His arrogant confidence entirely evaporated, replaced by a gnawing, desperate panic. He stood up and paced the length of the freezing room, his expensive leather shoes squeaking loudly against the hardwood floor. He felt incredibly small inside the massive, monumental corporate fortress. The walls seemed to close in around his frantic mind. He was entirely at the absolute mercy of an invisible giant he could not even clearly see today. The heavy oak doors finally swung open with a resounding thud that shattered the agonizing silence. Brent instantly stopped pacing and spun around, plastering an oily, confident smile across his pale face. He aggressively smoothed the lapels of his wrinkled suit jacket, entirely prepared to charm the legendary board chairman with apologies and promises of future returns. The confident smile immediately vanished from his face. It was not the elusive corporate billionaire stepping into the room. It was Jonathan Reed. The ruthless lead corporate attorney for Apex Holdings walked in with predatory grace, his face an unreadable mask of absolute legal authority. He did not offer a handshake or a polite greeting. Jonathan marched straight to the head of the polished conference table and forcefully dropped a thick, bright red folder onto the smooth wooden surface. The loud smack echoed sharply in the freezing air. Jonathan calmly unbuttoned his suit jacket and took a seat, staring directly into Brent's terrified eyes. He gestured toward the crimson file with a single, highly manicured finger. Brent slowly approached the table, his hands trembling violently as he flipped open the heavy cover. The folder did not contain investment strategies or term sheets. It was entirely filled with heavily highlighted certified bank statements. Jonathan leaned forward and began to systematically dismantle Brent's entire existence. The documents proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Brent had deliberately and maliciously embezzled corporate seed money for his own personal gratification. The highly highlighted lines directly traced hundreds of thousands of dollars funneled secretly through offshore shell corporations. Jonathan pointed to a massive transaction confirming Brent had brazenly purchased a luxury yacht under a fake corporate identity. He flipped the page, exposing an active, exorbitant commercial lease agreement for a sprawling downtown penthouse. The lease was not in Brent's name, nor was it registered to Dominique. It was signed and legally bound to the name of his secret mistress. Brent stared at the damning paperwork, completely unable to form a coherent sentence. The meticulously documented trail of financial fraud was entirely indisputable. He had used the Apex capital injection as a personal slush fund to finance an illicit double life. Jonathan crossed his arms over his broad chest, watching the highly arrogant tech founder rapidly realize that he was facing federal prison time. The corporate executioner had finally arrived to forcibly collect the absolute ultimate debt today. Brent frantically shoved the damning paperwork back across the table, shaking his head in absolute denial. He aggressively insisted that the false bank statements were entirely fabricated and maliciously manufactured to completely destroy his impeccable reputation. Jonathan ignored the desperate and pathetic protests. He calmly opened a secondary black folder and extracted a single sheet of heavily embossed corporate stationery. He slid the document across the smooth mahogany surface until it rested directly in front of Brent's trembling hands. Jonathan stated with icy precision that Brent was effectively terminated from his own startup company. The morality clause had been fully executed, transferring total ownership and absolute operational control directly back to Apex Holdings. Brent was no longer a tech visionary or a wealthy chief executive officer. He was utterly unemployed, completely broke, and legally barred from ever stepping foot inside Gallagher Innovations again. The sheer magnitude of the catastrophic loss finally broke through Brent's thick wall of profound arrogance. He slammed his fist down hard against the table, his face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He screamed at the top of his lungs, demanding to speak to the board chairman face-to-face immediately. He completely refused to accept that a faceless corporate entity could legally steal his entire life's work without a single personal confrontation. He yelled that he demanded the respect of a proper meeting with the man pulling the strings. He wanted to look the billionaire in the eye and negotiate his survival. Jonathan did not flinch at the aggressive outburst. He simply offered a very cold, knowing smile. He leaned back comfortably in his leather chair and calmly told Brent that the chairman had already personally delivered his final verdict the previous evening. Brent froze, his mind frantically scrambling to make sense of the cryptic statement. Jonathan slowly raised his right hand and pointed a single finger directly toward the far end of the freezing boardroom. Brent turned his head, his breathing ragged and shallow, following the lawyer's silent direction. He looked up toward the heavily shadowed wall positioned directly above the head chair. A massive, intricately framed oil portrait hung proudly there in absolute silence, completely dominating the immense corporate space. Brent stared blindly into the meticulously painted eyes of the legendary chairman, feeling the cold, hard floor completely vanish entirely beneath his visibly shaking feet in absolute terror right now today. Brent stared up at the massive oil portrait dominating the far wall of the freezing boardroom. The face gazing down at him did not belong to a confused, aging construction worker suffering from early-stage dementia. The artist had perfectly captured the sharp, calculating eyes of Waylon Freeman. The older African-American man was rendered in a flawless, bespoke tuxedo, radiating an aura of absolute, unshakable authority. He looked like a king observing a foolish peasant. The 5 words from the restaurant suddenly echoed through Brent's racing mind with deafening clarity. I own the parent company. The devastating reality of that brief sentence finally crushed the remaining breath from his lungs. The man he had deliberately humiliated, the man whose stake he had knocked onto the pristine floor just hours prior, was the legendary anonymous founder of Apex Holdings. Jonathan Reed sat silently at the mahogany table, calmly watching the profound terror wash over the arrogant tech executive. Jonathan did not need to offer any further explanation. The magnificent painting communicated the entire unvarnished truth. Brent felt his expensive Italian suit cling to his heavily sweating skin. He slowly backed away from the conference table, his gaze permanently locked onto the canvas. The meticulously crafted illusion of his false success evaporated instantly. Every single boast he had ever made about his brilliant business acumen was completely rendered pathetic. He had spent 3 entire years aggressively tearing down the exact billionaire who secretly funded his luxurious lifestyle and fully financed his mediocre startup. The profound magnitude of his own stupidity paralyzed his muscles. He had willingly handed over the absolute control of his company to Apex Holdings through the morality clause, foolishly believing he was dealing with an easily manipulated corporate entity. Instead, he had handed the executioner's axe directly to the very man he relentlessly abused. The freezing temperature of the room suddenly felt like the harsh, bitter bite of a winter blizzard. Brent stumbled backward, his leather shoes slipping slightly against the polished hardwood floor. The walls of the towering corporate fortress seemed to aggressively contract, sealing him inside a meticulously designed trap. Jonathan slowly closed the thick red folder containing the irrefutable evidence of the massive embezzlement. The distinct click of the heavy cardboard cover shutting sounded exactly like a heavy coffin lid slamming firmly closed on Brent's entire professional existence, completely and permanently right now, today, here. Brent violently shoved the heavy oak doors open and scrambled out of the freezing boardroom like a madman. He sprinted down the immaculate corridor, completely ignoring the startled security guards who watched his frantic retreat. His chest heaved with jagged breaths as he repeatedly punched the elevator call button. He felt physically sick, his stomach churning with the undeniable realization that his entire financial empire was an absolute fabrication. He had never been a brilliant visionary. He was nothing more than a highly subsidized charity case completely dependent on his father-in-law. Waylon Freeman had silently handed him the world on a silver platter, and Brent had arrogantly spit directly in his face. The elevator doors finally slid open and he rushed inside, pulling his smartphone from his pocket. His hand shook uncontrollably as he frantically dialed Dominique's personal number. He needed his wife. He needed her to beg her father for absolute mercy. He pressed the device hard against his sweating ear, listening to the endless ringing. The automated voicemail system clicked on. He cursed loudly and hit redial. Again, the call went entirely unanswered. Dominique was deliberately ignoring his calls, actively severing the primary lifeline he desperately required right now. He exited the towering building and practically sprinted toward the nearby valet stand. He aggressively snatched the keys from the startled attendant without leaving a tip. He threw himself into the driver's seat of his luxury Porsche, gripping the leather steering wheel until his knuckles turned completely white. The reality of his profound failure burned through his veins. The company was completely gone. The massive penthouse lease for his mistress was actively bouncing payments. His entire perfectly constructed universe had been surgically dismantled by the very man he deemed a pathetic failure. Waylon had orchestrated this entire absolute destruction without ever raising his voice. Brent slammed his foot onto the heavy accelerator. The powerful engine roared loudly in the crowded concrete parking garage. He refused to simply roll over and casually accept this total financial execution. He convinced his broken ego that Waylon was still just a frail older man who could easily be bullied into complete submission. He fully believed physical intimidation would instantly force the chairman to swiftly reverse the aggressive corporate takeover and legally reinstate his absolute authority over the tech startup immediately today, right now, without fail, in this desperate, frantic, fleeting moment. Blinded by sheer rage and consuming panic, Brent tore out of the downtown parking garage and swerved recklessly into the dense afternoon city traffic. He completely ignored the furious blaring horns of the surrounding vehicles as he aggressively cut across 3 busy lanes. His mind was a dark, swirling vortex of extreme desperation. He floored the gas pedal, pushing the sleek sports car well beyond the legal speed limit. The towering skyscrapers quickly blurred into modest residential neighborhoods as he sped directly toward Waylon's quiet suburban home. He violently ran a solid red light at a major intersection, narrowly avoiding a devastating collision with a heavy delivery truck. The close call did not slow him down. It only fueled the destructive adrenaline pumping fiercely through his highly stressed nervous system. He actively convinced himself that the brilliant billionaire chairman of Apex Holdings was absolutely nothing but a physical illusion. In Brent's severely warped reality, Waylon Freeman remained the exact same quiet, submissive old man he had ruthlessly mocked at the restaurant. He believed pure physical aggression would easily shatter the older man's confident corporate facade. Brent planned to kick the front door wide open and corner Waylon inside his own modest living room. He would stand over him, utilizing his towering height and younger strength to extract immediate compliance. He fully intended to violently demand the immediate signing of legally binding documents that would completely surrender Gallagher Innovations directly back into his eager hands. He gripped the steering wheel, breathing heavily as he rehearsed the vicious threats he would actively hurl at his father-in-law. He would promise to utterly destroy Dominique's life if the funding was not instantly fully restored. He firmly believed a father's love would be the ultimate fatal weakness he could efficiently exploit. The sleek Porsche screeched loudly around the final residential corner, leaving thick black tire marks violently scarred across the quiet suburban asphalt. He spotted the familiar wooden gate of the modest property approaching rapidly through his windshield. Brent slammed hard on the brakes, bringing the luxury vehicle to a chaotic, jarring halt directly in front of Waylon's neatly manicured front lawn. He killed the engine, completely unaware that the old man waiting calmly inside was absolutely fully prepared for his arrival right now in this very tense, violent, chaotic, highly dangerous, final, desperate, terrifying, unpredictable, reckless, completely insane, unhinged physical confrontation today. The heavy wooden gate splintered inward with a loud crack as Brent delivered a vicious kick to the latch. He did not bother knocking or announcing his arrival. He marched straight up the concrete walkway and threw his entire body weight against the front door, bursting into the modest living room like a rabid animal. His custom suit was completely ruined, soaked in cold sweat and wrinkled from his manic drive across the city. His eyes were heavily bloodshot, bulging with a toxic mixture of absolute terror and unhinged rage. He scanned the quiet space frantically until he finally locked his desperate eyes onto my figure. I was sitting calmly in my worn leather reading chair, entirely unbothered by his dramatic and violent entrance. Brent crossed the room in 3 long strides, towering over me while clenching his fists at his sides. He screamed that the malicious corporate game was officially over. He demanded I pick up the phone immediately and order my lawyer Jonathan Reed to completely reverse the cancellation of the Gallagher Innovations funding contract. He aggressively pointed a shaking finger directly at my face, fully believing his physical presence would force my immediate submission. When I remained completely silent, his desperation escalated into sheer viciousness. He played the only card he believed he had left in his pathetic hand. Brent leaned down his face mere inches from mine and delivered a highly calculated threat. He promised that if the $10 million did not reappear in his corporate accounts by the end of the business day, he would immediately file for a brutal and highly public divorce from Dominique. He swore he would drag her name through the mud and legally bankrupt her in court. But his cruelty did not stop there. He dropped his voice into a sinister whisper, revealing a secret Dominique had not even shared with me yet. He stated that she was 3 months pregnant with their first child. He coldly vowed to hire a team of ruthless lawyers to take absolute and full legal custody of my unborn grandchild. He promised I would never be allowed to see the child for as long as I lived. He stood back, breathing heavily, entirely convinced that threatening the total destruction of my daughter and my future grandchild would instantly break my resolve and force me to surrender my immense wealth to him immediately today. I did not flinch or react to his vile ultimatum. I remained perfectly still in my leather chair, staring back at him with absolute icy detachment. The sheer malice of his words confirmed everything I already knew about his deeply toxic character. He expected me to shatter, to weep, or to surrender on my knees to protect my daughter. Instead, I simply reached my right hand under the thick wooden edge of my reading table. My fingers found the small, discreet electronic fob permanently mounted to the underside of the heavy wood. I pressed the smooth plastic button precisely once. The silent signal was transmitted instantly. Brent continued breathing heavily, his chest heaving as he waited for my total capitulation, completely unaware of the immediate consequence of his actions. Less than 2 seconds later, the heavy swinging door leading to my kitchen was forcefully pushed open. 2 massive, highly trained private security contractors stepped seamlessly into the living room. They were dressed in immaculate black tactical suits, their expressions completely devoid of any emotion. I had employed these specific men for over a decade to quietly manage high-level corporate physical threats. They moved with terrifying synchronized speed and absolute silence, rapidly closing the short distance between the kitchen and the center of the room. Brent heard their heavy boots against the floorboards and began to turn his head in sudden confusion. He never even completed the motion. The first contractor lunged forward with explosive power, driving his thick forearm violently into the center of Brent's chest. At the exact same fraction of a second, the second contractor aggressively swept his heavy tactical boot behind Brent's ankles. The flawlessly coordinated strike instantly swept Brent's legs entirely out from underneath him. He was completely airborne for a terrifying, weightless moment before crashing brutally down onto the solid hardwood floor. The heavy impact knocked the breath completely out of his lungs. Before he could even attempt to struggle or gasp for air, the 2 enormous men descended upon him. They forcefully grabbed his expensive suit jacket, violently twisting his arms behind his back, and aggressively pinned his face directly against the cold wooden planks. His cheeks smashed harshly into the floorboards, completely neutralizing his pathetic physical threat entirely, in absolute and perfect silence today, right now, in this very room, without a single word being spoken out loud at all right here. I slowly pushed myself up from my comfortable reading chair, adjusting the cuffs of my simple flannel shirt with deliberate and calm precision. I walked casually across the living room carpet, stopping only when the toes of my old work boots were mere inches from Brent's terrified, bloodshot eyes. He lay completely helpless, his cheek pressed firmly against the hardwood floor by the massive hands of my security team. He could not move a single muscle, but his wide, panicked eyes darted frantically up toward my face. He finally understood the absolute crushing magnitude of his fatal miscalculation. I reached into the deep front pocket of my faded denim jeans and retrieved a single, neatly folded sheet of heavy legal paper. I slowly unfolded the document and let it drift gracefully down toward the floor. It landed softly, coming to a rest exactly 2 inches from Brent's heavily sweating nose. I watched his desperate eyes focus on the bold, black text printed across the top of the official document. I explained to him in a quiet, incredibly cold voice that the massive luxury mansion he currently resided in did not actually belong to him or his failed startup. It never had. I revealed that the expansive property was legally purchased 3 years ago by an anonymous corporate shell trust. That specific trust was entirely funded and fully owned by Apex Holdings, which meant the grand suburban estate belonged exclusively to me. Brent let out a muffled, pathetic whimper of pure defeat as the final pillar of his fabricated lifestyle violently collapsed. I told him he had precisely 24 hours to completely pack his personal belongings and permanently vacate the premises. The legal eviction notice demanded his immediate and total removal from the property by tomorrow afternoon. If he refused to comply, my security team would forcibly throw him into the street. I leaned down slightly, ensuring my final words echoed deep inside his shattered ego. I warned him never to threaten my daughter or my unborn grandchild ever again. I stood back up, signaling my security contractors to drag him out of my quiet home. I watched them easily haul his limp, utterly defeated body out through the splintered front door, finally securing the absolute justice and ultimate retribution he so desperately deserved without a single doubt right now in this exact quiet moment, perfectly resolved today, forever, right here. The heavy wooden front door shuddered violently against its hinges before swinging wide open. Dominique stormed into my living room, her face flushed and her designer coat thrown hastily over her shoulders. Exactly 1 hour had passed since my security team forcibly removed her husband from these exact premises. Brent had clearly wasted absolutely no time weaponizing his cellular phone the moment he landed on the sidewalk. He had predictably spun a masterful, completely fabricated web of profound victimhood and malicious lies. Dominique stood in the center of the room, her chest heaving as hot tears streamed freely down her pale cheeks. She did not bother to ask for my version of the morning and its chaotic events. She immediately launched into a hysterical, piercing tirade, her voice cracking under the immense weight of her husband and his toxic narrative. She accused me of actively and deliberately destroying her fragile marriage out of sheer petty jealousy. According to the twisted story Brent had just fed her, I had suffered a massive psychological break and hired aggressive thugs to physically assault him. He convinced her that my entire corporate intervention was nothing but a bitter, spiteful maneuver designed to ruin his phenomenal success simply because I could not bear to see him outshine my own legacy. She pointed a trembling finger at my chest, sobbing heavily as she screamed that I was a vindictive, controlling monster. She claimed I had manipulated the financial markets just to force her husband to his knees. She believed every single poisoned syllable he had poured into her ear during his frantic phone call. She completely ignored the obvious reality that a retired construction worker could not possibly orchestrate a global corporate takeover without wielding legitimate absolute power. Her blinding loyalty to that pathetic narcissist completely overrode her lifelong relationship with her own father. She wept loudly, screaming that I was actively trying to rip her future family apart out of pure spite. She demanded to know how I could be so incredibly cruel to the man she loved. I sat quietly in my worn leather reading chair, completely motionless, allowing the vicious storm of her misplaced anger to wash over me. I watched the profound manipulation completely consume her rational thought process. Brent had successfully weaponized her emotions against me, utilizing her profound fear of abandonment to actively shield himself from the absolute ruin he had rightfully earned today. I did not offer a single word of argument or defense against her frantic accusations. I knew that arguing with a victim of profound psychological manipulation was entirely useless. Any verbal defense would simply validate the twisted narrative her toxic husband had so carefully constructed. I allowed her to exhaust herself completely. When her frantic screams finally faded into exhausted, ragged sobs, I slowly stood up from my comfortable leather chair. I walked calmly across the room toward the heavy wooden desk positioned near the large front window. I reached down and picked up the thick, bright red folder Jonathan Reed had delivered to me earlier this morning. The heavy cardboard cover contained the absolute unvarnished truth regarding the man she fiercely defended. I turned around, walking slowly back to the center of the living room. I gently placed the crimson file directly onto the low glass coffee table positioned right in front of her trembling knees. I looked deeply into her tear-filled eyes and spoke with a quiet, unwavering voice. I told her that I had not destroyed her marriage out of petty jealousy. I explained that her husband had actively destroyed it himself through extreme arrogance and relentless deceit. I gestured toward the red folder resting on the smooth glass surface. I gently instructed her to open the cover and examine the certified documents waiting inside. I told her to look closely at the highlighted bank statements proving Brent had systematically embezzled corporate seed money for his own personal gratification. I specifically mentioned the massive luxury yacht he had secretly purchased using heavily disguised offshore shell accounts. I watched her face pale slightly as the reality of my calm demeanor began to clash violently against Brent and his frantic lies. I urged her to turn the page and read the exorbitant commercial lease agreement for a sprawling downtown penthouse. I made sure to clearly state that the expensive property was not legally registered in her name. I revealed that the penthouse was exclusively leased to finance a luxurious double life for his secret mistress. I stood completely still, watching the devastating truth hover in the quiet air between us. The undeniable physical proof of his absolute betrayal was resting right at her fingertips, waiting for her to simply reach out, open the heavy cardboard cover, and finally break the vicious cycle of manipulation today in this room. Dominique stared down at the bright red folder resting silently on the glass coffee table. Her breathing became incredibly shallow, her entire body trembling as the agonizing reality of the situation slowly materialized in her mind. For a brief, terrifying second, I saw her resolve genuinely waver. Her eyes darted rapidly between my calm face and the official documents containing the absolute destruction of her carefully curated life. She knew deep in her heart that I was not lying. She intuitively recognized the cruel manipulative patterns I had just described. Patterns she had actively ignored for 3 entire years, simply to maintain the beautiful illusion of her perfect marriage. However, confronting the unvarnished truth was entirely too painful for her fragile ego to process right now. Admitting that she had been utterly foolish, actively manipulated, and callously betrayed by the man she loved would completely shatter her core identity. She squeezed her eyes tightly shut, shaking her head side to side in fierce, stubborn denial. She aggressively refused to open the heavy cardboard cover. She absolutely refused to look at the undeniable bank statements, the yacht receipts, or the penthouse lease bearing the name of another woman. She violently swung her arm in a wide, sweeping arc, aggressively knocking the crimson file directly off the table. The heavy folder crashed onto the floor, scattering the certified corporate documents across the woven living room rug. She backed away from the evidence, wrapping her designer coat tightly around her shoulders like a protective shield. She lifted her chin, her face twisting into a mask of pure defiance. She loudly declared that she would absolutely stand by her husband no matter what lies I desperately tried to fabricate. She promised she would never forgive me for this incredible cruelty. She turned around abruptly and marched straight out the front door without a single backward glance. I watched her hurry down the concrete walkway, completely retreating back into the comforting arms of a narcissistic monster. I did not call out or try to stop her departure. I simply nodded my head once in quiet acceptance. I walked slowly toward the entrance, firmly closing the heavy wooden door. I reached up and turned the solid brass deadbolt, hearing the heavy mechanical click echo loudly through the empty house. The financial safety net was officially completely severed and permanently destroyed right now in this moment today. Brent sat inside the suffocating leather interior of his sports car, his hands trembling violently as he gripped the steering wheel. The freezing reality of his sudden eviction and absolute termination crashed down upon him. He pulled his smartphone from his ruined suit jacket and frantically scrolled through his extensive contact list. He bypassed his former employees and directly selected the personal numbers of the wealthy venture capitalists who had attended the celebratory dinner the previous evening. These were the exact same elite executives who had loudly laughed at his cruel jokes and openly mocked Wayland's worn clothing. Brent convinced his desperate mind that these powerful men would eagerly extend a bridge loan to save his brilliant corporate vision. He dialed the first number, plastering a remarkably fake tone of casual confidence onto his voice. The senior partner answered the call with polite curiosity. Brent immediately launched into a rapid, highly sanitized explanation of a minor administrative banking glitch. He requested a temporary, massive $10 million cash injection to float his operational costs for a single week. The investor listened quietly until Brent inadvertently mentioned that Apex Holdings was involved in the sudden account freeze. The tone on the other end of the line instantly turned incredibly cold. The billionaire partner sharply interrupted Brent's frantic pitching. Word travels with terrifying speed within the elite financial district. The partner bluntly informed Brent that Jonathan Reed had already circulated a private, severe corporate memorandum officially blacklisting Gallagher Innovations. The venture capitalist explicitly stated that nobody in the city would dare risk crossing a formidable giant like Apex Holdings to save a highly toxic, disgraced founder. He abruptly terminated the call, leaving a sharp click ringing in Brent's ear. Brent dialed a second partner, then a third, and finally a fourth. Every single conversation followed the exact same devastating trajectory. The moment the word Apex left his lips, the elite businessmen instantly severed all communication. The powerful social circle he had spent 3 years desperately trying to infiltrate discarded him without a single ounce of hesitation or mercy. They viewed him strictly as a radioactive liability. He slammed his phone against the dashboard, screaming obscenities into the empty vehicle. The absolute realization settled heavily into his bones. His carefully manufactured reputation was completely obliterated. He was entirely isolated, cut off from the prestigious world he worshipped, and rapidly running out of time. Brent stared blankly at the glowing dashboard of his expensive German sports car. He tightly gripped the premium stitched leather steering wheel, desperately trying to draw comfort from the sheer luxury of the vehicle. For the past 3 years, this sleek machine had served as his ultimate status symbol, aggressively broadcasting his incredible wealth to anyone who saw him drive past. He loved watching the jealous stares of ordinary pedestrians and the respectful nods of parking valets. He used the vehicle to convince Dominique that he was a wildly successful entrepreneur perfectly capable of providing a billionaire lifestyle. The devastating truth was entirely different. Brent did not actually own the high-performance car. He had never possessed the massive personal capital required to purchase such an outrageously expensive asset outright. Instead, he had secretly leased the vehicle under the official corporate umbrella of Gallagher Innovations. He aggressively manipulated the company ledgers, hiding the massive monthly payments by actively disguising them as essential corporate transportation expenses. As long as Apex Holdings continued blindly pumping seed money into his fragile startup, the illusion remained completely secure. But Jonathan Reed had meticulously executed the morality clause and forcefully seized total control of the company early this morning. By officially terminating Brent's position and locking down all corporate banking accounts, the parent company legally halted every single scheduled payment instantly. The powerful international bank holding the lease was immediately notified of the catastrophic default. Modern corporate leasing agreements contained incredibly aggressive forfeiture clauses, particularly regarding luxury assets tied to disgraced executives. Without the corporate funds to cover the incredibly high monthly premium, the vehicle instantly became active stolen property. Brent was completely oblivious to the digital alert currently transmitting from the GPS tracking unit deeply embedded inside the engine block. The bank had already initiated an immediate repossession order. He shifted the car into drive, aggressively revving the powerful engine. His chaotic mind quickly devised a new, highly dangerous plan. He decided to seek out an incredibly shady underground loan shark he had met at a private poker game months ago. He believed he could secure a massive unregulated cash loan using the physical car as collateral. He completely failed to realize that the sleek machine carrying him toward his incredibly illegal salvation was already actively targeted for immediate and absolute total confiscation by a ruthless financial institution right now today in this very moment. Brent violently swerved the highly expensive German sports car into the pristine, perfectly manicured driveway of his highly exclusive, incredibly prestigious suburban country club. He rapidly navigated the long, winding asphalt path, aggressively cutting off a wealthy older couple driving a golf cart. He slammed the brakes, bringing the vehicle to a chaotic, sliding halt directly in front of the grand clubhouse entrance. Several affluent club members paused their afternoon conversations on the expansive outdoor terrace to stare down at his entirely reckless arrival. Brent completely ignored their judgmental glares. He immediately reached for the heavy silver door handle, fully prepared to march inside and locate the dangerous underground financier waiting by the private bar. Before he could even unbuckle his seatbelt, a massive, heavily customized industrial tow truck aggressively roared into the circular driveway. The heavy diesel engine drowned out the polite background music playing across the country club patio. The massive truck violently reversed, screeching loudly as it instantly blocked Brent's vehicle from moving an inch forward. A large, heavily tattooed recovery agent jumped out of the roaring cab holding a digital tablet. Brent furiously rolled down his tinted window, loudly screaming at the large man to move his pathetic garbage truck immediately. The agent simply smirked, tapping the glowing screen of his device. He loudly announced to the entire gathering crowd that the vehicle was officially marked for mandatory corporate repossession due to extreme financial default. Brent turned completely pale as the agent swiftly attached heavy steel cables securely around the front axles of the expensive car. The incredibly humiliating scene unfolded directly in front of the most elite, powerful social circle in the entire city. The wealthy club members actively leaned over the decorative balcony, openly whispering and pointing directly at the disgraced executive. Brent desperately scrambled out of the driver's seat, physically grabbing the heavy steel cables and screaming empty, pathetic threats. The tough agent forcefully shoved him backward onto the hard concrete asphalt without a single ounce of hesitation. The massive hydraulic winch whined loudly, aggressively, lifting the sleek luxury car high into the afternoon air. Brent sat entirely stranded on the cold, unforgiving pavement, watching his ultimate status symbol being towed away like common trash. His complete social and financial destruction was now an absolute, undeniable public spectacle. He had absolutely nowhere left to hide today, right now, in this exact fleeting moment. Brent stood on the scorching asphalt of the country club parking lot, entirely stripped of his pride and his luxury vehicle. The public humiliation burned through his veins like acid. He realized that financial manipulation and physical intimidation had both failed spectacularly against his father-in-law. His mind rapidly pivoted to the absolute darkest strategy available in his playbook. He aggressively hailed a passing taxi and ordered the driver to take him directly to the Central Police Precinct. He marched through the heavy glass doors of the station, immediately weaponizing his tailored suit and his arrogant corporate demeanor. He approached the front desk and demanded to speak with a senior detective regarding a highly urgent family crisis. He was escorted into a cramped, sterile interview room where he unleashed a meticulously fabricated narrative. Brent stared directly into the eyes of the lead investigator and completely lied under oath. He desperately needed to establish an airtight legal record against his adversary. He claimed that Waylon Freeman was suffering from a rapidly accelerating, highly aggressive form of severe dementia. He spun a terrifying tale of a deeply confused, highly paranoid old man lashing out at his loving family. Brent firmly stated that Waylon had recently suffered a massive psychotic break and had actively hired dangerous cybercriminals to maliciously hack and completely dismantle Gallagher Innovations. He portrayed himself as a deeply concerned son-in-law, desperately trying to protect his wife and his ruined business from a senile man wielding dangerous financial resources. He leaned across the metal table and formally requested immediate law enforcement intervention. He demanded the police initiate an emergency medical conservatorship to strip Waylon of his civil rights and his financial autonomy. Brent calculatingly utilized all the correct legal buzzwords to trigger mandatory state protocols regarding vulnerable seniors. He claimed Waylon was an immediate severe danger to himself and the public. He filed the official police report with a perfectly steady hand, completely willing to commit absolute perjury just to regain access to the immense Apex Holdings fortune. He believed the authorities would simply view Waylon as another frail senior citizen losing his grip on reality. He walked out of the precinct entirely convinced that the slow grinding wheels of the legal system would efficiently crush his father-in-law by nightfall. The deeply toxic plot to forcibly commit a perfectly sane man was now officially set into aggressive motion right now today. Precisely 2 hours after Brent filed his malicious perjury, a heavy knock echoed through the quiet halls of my modest suburban home. I walked slowly to the front entrance and opened the heavy wooden door to find 2 uniformed police officers standing firmly on my porch. The lead detective introduced himself with a stiff, highly serious expression, stating that they were responding to an urgent wellness check requested by a deeply concerned family member. He carefully explained that a formal report had been filed, claiming I was suffering from severe cognitive decline and exhibiting highly dangerous, completely erratic behavior. I did not act offended or raise my voice in defensive anger. Instead, I offered them a warm, polite smile and calmly invited both officers inside my home. I led them into the pristine living room and graciously offered them freshly brewed tea. The absolute tranquility of my demeanor immediately clashed against the frantic, terrifying narrative Brent had undoubtedly spun for them at the precinct. They sat awkwardly on my comfortable sofa while I walked over to the wooden desk. I returned to the low-glass coffee table and handed the lead detective a crisp, perfectly embossed business card belonging directly to Jonathan Reed, the chief legal counsel for Apex Holdings. I politely instructed the officers to call that specific number if they required any further corporate clarification. Then I placed a thick, legally notarized document directly into the detective's hands. It was a certified psychiatric evaluation and a comprehensive financial statement issued by a renowned private medical board just 3 days ago. The documentation proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that I possessed absolute mental clarity and maintained complete, flawless control over my vast global assets. I sat quietly in my leather reading chair, sipping my hot tea while the lead detective meticulously read through the irrefutable evidence. He quickly realized that the fragile, senile old man he expected to find was actually a highly articulate, incredibly sharp billionaire completely in charge of his faculties. The false police report was nothing more than a desperate retaliatory strike by a failed executive. The officers exchanged a very knowing, incredibly quiet glance. They instantly understood that they had been deliberately manipulated and brazenly used as ignorant pawns in a vicious corporate divorce. The entire fraudulent investigation was completely dismantled without a single raised voice occurring today right now in this exact room. The lead detective carefully placed the certified medical evaluation back onto the smooth glass coffee table with profound respect. The heavy tension inside the living room entirely evaporated instantly, replaced by a mutual unspoken understanding between two highly observant men. The officer offered a sincere formal apology for the incredibly intrusive, unwanted disruption to my quiet evening. He clearly recognized that utilizing municipal law enforcement to settle a petty corporate vendetta was a massive waste of precious public resources. He promised to file a counter-report detailing Brent's blatant perjury and malicious intent, entirely shielding my legal autonomy from any further police intervention. I nodded graciously, fully accepting his professional apology while commending his diligence. I stood up from my leather reading chair to politely escort both officers toward the front entrance. We walked slowly through the hallway, the atmosphere noticeably lighter. However, just as the detective reached out to turn the heavy brass doorknob, he paused abruptly. He turned back around, his face suddenly tightening into a mask of grim, absolute seriousness. He dropped his voice into a hushed, highly confidential whisper, deciding to share a deeply alarming piece of inside information directly from the precinct file. He explicitly warned me that Brent's desperate strategy was not entirely limited to a single fabricated police report. The detective revealed that Brent had recently wired a massive, entirely illegal bribe directly to a highly shady, incredibly corrupt private psychiatrist operating within the city. This particular doctor possessed the direct legal authority to bypass standard judicial oversight procedures completely. The officer warned me that this purchased medical professional had already signed an aggressive mandatory psychiatric hold order entirely based on Brent's fabricated testimony. The terrifying document was currently moving swiftly through the municipal system. The detective looked me squarely in the eyes and delivered the ultimate, chilling hook. A fully armed medical transport team, accompanied directly by the heavily bribed doctor, was officially mandated to arrive at my front door at exactly 8 o'clock the following morning. They possessed the legal jurisdiction to forcibly strap me to a gurney and aggressively haul me into a locked psychiatric facility against my will. The officers quickly exited the house, leaving me standing entirely alone in the quiet hallway. The silent corporate battle had just violently escalated into an incredibly dangerous, highly literal fight for my absolute and complete physical freedom right now, today, here. The harsh fluorescent lights of the sterile clinic examination room buzzed loudly overhead. Waylon sat perfectly still on the uncomfortable vinyl chair, his posture radiating absolute authority despite the incredibly hostile environment. Exactly at 8 o'clock this morning, the mandated medical transport team had arrived at his front door, fully expecting a frantic, confused senior citizen resisting legal transport. Instead, they found a billionaire chairman waiting calmly in the foyer, fully dressed and entirely willing to comply with the fraudulent psychiatric order. Now sitting across a small metal desk, the highly bribed psychiatrist stared at Waylon with immense, dripping condescension. The doctor held a thick clipboard, his pen poised to officially ruin Waylon's life. He began the interrogation with deliberately insulting elementary questions designed specifically to provoke an aggressive defensive response. He asked Wayland to identify the current president, count backward from 100 by sevens, and explain the basic concept of a checking account. The doctor laced every single sentence with patronizing pity, treating the formidable corporate titan like a severely damaged toddler. He actively tried to agitate Wayland, hoping to manufacture the exact hostile behavior Brent had paid him to document. Wayland completely refused to take the bait. He answered every single demeaning question with chilling absolute perfection. His voice remained incredibly steady, his tone entirely devoid of any emotional fluctuation. He recited complex financial algorithms, effortlessly quoted recent global market trends, and provided highly detailed, perfectly accurate historical timelines. He locked his intense gaze directly onto the corrupt doctor, unblinking and utterly fearless. The psychiatrist grew visibly frustrated by the total lack of compliance. He aggressively shifted his strategy, asking highly leading, entirely fabricated questions regarding Wayland's recent corporate actions. He insinuated that Wayland had suffered a massive mental breakdown leading to the sudden cancellation of the Gallagher Innovations funding. He framed the legal corporate seizure as a dangerous, paranoid delusion. Wayland simply smiled, a cold, calculated expression that carried absolutely no warmth. He calmly detailed the exact legal parameters of the morality clause, utilizing incredibly precise corporate terminology that clearly demonstrated a brilliant, highly functioning mind. He provided an airtight, perfectly rational justification for every single business decision he had executed over the past 2 full days. The doctor aggressively scratched furious notes onto his official pad, visibly struggling to maintain the completely false narrative he had been illegally paid to successfully construct right now today. Wayland observed the corrupt psychiatrist deliberately twisting his perfectly rational answers into wildly inaccurate, clinically alarming symptoms. The malicious doctor intentionally scribbled heavy, aggressive notes, systematically translating Wayland's brilliant corporate acumen into terrifying evidence of severe psychological delusions. Wayland clearly understood that this single written evaluation possessed the immense legal power to completely strip away his civil rights, permanently freeze his massive global assets, and forcibly lock him inside a heavily guarded psychiatric ward indefinitely. The fraudulent doctor finally stopped writing, staring across the metal desk with a deeply sinister, victorious smirk. He pompously declared that Wayland was suffering from advanced paranoia and required immediate indefinite medical conservatorship to prevent further corporate destruction. Wayland did not argue, raise his voice, or display any signs of panic. Instead, he calmly reached his right hand deep into the front pocket of his tailored slacks. He smoothly extracted a small, sleek digital recording device and placed it gently onto the center of the cold metal desk. He silently pressed the glowing green playback button. The crisp, incredibly clear audio instantly filled the sterile clinic room. The undeniable sound of Brent's frantic, panicked voice echoed loudly through the small space. Brent was actively begging the psychiatrist to illegally manufacture a horrific dementia diagnosis, explicitly promising a massive $50,000 cash bribe in return for immediate legal compliance. The recording flawlessly captured the doctor enthusiastically accepting the illegal payment, openly discussing the precise medical terminology he would utilize to successfully manipulate the strict judicial system. The undeniable damning audio perfectly recorded the two men actively conspiring to execute a highly illegal, devastating medical coup. Wayland sat completely motionless, watching the sheer absolute terror violently consume the doctor's arrogant expression. The psychiatrist completely froze his pen, dropping from his trembling fingers and clattering loudly onto the polished floor. The recorded audio continued playing, detailing the exact offshore banking instructions the doctor had provided to receive his illicit payment. Wayland reached forward, pressing the button to stop the recording right as the corrupt negotiation concluded. He stared directly into the doctor's panicked wide eyes, maintaining absolute, terrifying silence. The immense gravity of the incredibly illegal conspiracy crushed the psychiatrist instantly. His entire medical career, his prestigious reputation, and his personal freedom were completely destroyed in mere seconds by the very man he sought to illegally imprison today, right here, now, forever, permanently, without fail at all. The corrupt doctor turned a ghostly, sickening shade of pale as the devastating reality of his immediate criminal exposure completely crushed his lungs. He began gasping for air, his eyes darting frantically around the small clinic room like a cornered animal. Without speaking a single word, he desperately grabbed the thick clipboard containing his heavily fabricated medical evaluation. He violently ripped the heavy pages directly from the metal clamp and practically sprinted across the polished linoleum floor toward an industrial paper shredder sitting in the corner. Waylon watched with a cold, merciless expression as the psychiatrist feverishly fed the damning lies directly into the steel blades, aggressively obliterating the only physical evidence of his attempted medical coup. Waylon calmly retrieved his digital recorder, slowly standing up from the uncomfortable vinyl chair. He confidently informed the trembling, utterly broken man that Apex Holdings' elite legal team would be permanently seizing his medical license by tomorrow afternoon. While Waylon steadily marched out of the sterile facility, a totally free man, his ruthless attorney Jonathan Reed, was already unleashing the next devastating phase of absolute destruction. Jonathan officially filed a massive, incredibly aggressive federal lawsuit directly against Brent in downtown civil court. The comprehensive legal filing explicitly charged the disgraced executive with severe judicial abuse, malicious extortion, and corporate sabotage. Jonathan strategically leaked the explosive legal documents directly to the eager financial press, guaranteeing Brent's total public annihilation. Meanwhile, directly across the bustling city, the harsh consequences of Brent's frozen assets finally reached their inevitable destination. His secret mistress lounged carelessly inside the sprawling downtown penthouse, completely oblivious to the morning's incredibly chaotic corporate bloodbath. She confidently approached a high-end luxury boutique counter to purchase an incredibly expensive diamond necklace. When she proudly handed the merchant her heavily funded corporate platinum card, the automated payment terminal instantly blinked a bright, glaring red. The screen boldly declared the transaction forcefully declined. She scoffed furiously, swiping a second card, then a third, and finally a fourth. Every single premium account linked to Gallagher Innovations was absolutely entirely shut down. The pampered mistress stared in sheer, unadulterated horror as the relentless financial pipeline abruptly snapped shut. The luxurious, deceptive world Brent had so carefully constructed using stolen corporate seed money was finally completely vaporized. Every single trace of his massive financial deception was now permanently erased from existence right here today, without any question at all. The harsh metallic clank of the penthouse electronic deadbolt flashing a solid red error code sent a violent shockwave through Chloe. The luxury property management firm had not simply deactivated her keycard, they had forcefully evicted her, leaving her designer luggage stacked carelessly in the sterile hallway. Her platinum credit cards were completely frozen, declining 5 consecutive times at the luxury boutique just hours earlier. The endless gushing pipeline of stolen corporate cash had vanished into thin air. Blinded by sudden poverty and sheer rage, she marched straight to the private parking garage and aggressively threw herself into her personal vehicle. She floored the accelerator, tearing out of the downtown sector and speeding directly toward the affluent suburban sanctuary Brent had always desperately kept her away from. She possessed the exact address of his massive luxury estate. He had foolishly bragged about the sprawling property details during their expensive, champagne-fueled weekends on the company yacht. She violently pulled into the expansive circular driveway, completely ignoring the deep tire marks permanently scarred across the pristine asphalt from the morning's humiliating tow truck incident. Chloe slammed her car door and stomped aggressively up the grand concrete steps. She pounded her fists violently against the heavy oak front door, loudly demanding her promised monthly allowance. She fully expected a terrified, defeated Brent to scramble out and desperately hand over a thick stack of emergency cash to ensure her permanent silence. The heavy brass lock clicked loudly, but Brent did not emerge from the shadows of the grand foyer. Instead, the heavy door swung slowly open to reveal the extremely pale, deeply exhausted face of Dominique. The two women stared at each other in absolute heavy silence. Dominique stood frozen in the grand entryway, her hands instinctively moving to protect her slightly swollen stomach. She had spent the entire afternoon desperately clinging to the comforting lies Brent had woven, actively refusing to believe her father's undeniable proof. Now the living, breathing physical evidence of her husband's massive deception was standing right on her own front porch. Chloe looked Dominique up and down with intense, calculating disdain. She did not possess a single ounce of shame or remorse regarding her disruptive arrival. She aggressively crossed her arms over her chest, demanding to know exactly where Brent was hiding and exactly when she was getting her stolen cash paid out right now today, exactly here. Dominique instinctively tried to close the heavy front door, but Chloe aggressively jammed her designer boot perfectly into the narrow gap. A vicious, highly volatile argument instantly ignited across the pristine suburban porch. Dominique fiercely defended her completely ruined marriage, loudly ordering the strange woman to leave her property immediately before she called the police. Chloe merely laughed, a harsh, incredibly grating sound that cut directly through the humid evening air. She openly mocked Dominique's pathetic blind loyalty to a chronic liar. To completely shatter the lingering illusion, Chloe maliciously began listing incredibly specific, highly intimate details regarding Brent's physical habits and deeply guarded corporate secrets. She casually mentioned the unique birthmark hidden on his left shoulder and correctly described the exact layout of his private office safe. Dominique felt the remaining blood rapidly drain from her entire face. She desperately ordered the cruel intruder to stop speaking, but Chloe mercilessly pressed the attack. She completely weaponized the specific timeline of her incredibly expensive romantic getaways. Chloe proudly declared that Brent had flown her directly to a private villa in Cabo San Lucas just 2 months prior. She aggressively bragged about the 5 days they spent drinking vintage champagne while completely ignoring his ringing cellular phone. The exact dates struck Dominique like a devastating physical blow to the chest. The terrifying realization completely paralyzed her vocal cords. Those were the precise 5 days Dominique had spent entirely alone inside a sterile hospital room, suffering from a highly severe, potentially fatal pregnancy complication. Brent had explicitly told her he was trapped in an emergency corporate fundraising summit in Tokyo, completely unreachable due to extreme time zone differences and aggressive boardroom negotiations. He had left her utterly terrified, weeping alone, while nurses frantically monitored her unstable vitals, all so he could actively romance his expensive mistress on a sun-drenched beach. The absolute sheer magnitude of his monstrous betrayal permanently shattered Dominique's entire worldview. Every single lie he had ever told her instantly crystallized into a sickening, undeniable truth. The crimson file her father had gently placed on the glass coffee table was absolutely real. She slowly stepped backward into the grand foyer, completely dropping her defensive posture. Chloe continued shouting demanding threats regarding her stolen money, but Dominique could no longer hear her toxic voice over the deafening roaring sound of her own breaking heart right now today, perfectly, completely, forever here. Dominique numbly pushed the heavy front door shut completely, ignoring the enraged woman still shouting wildly on the front porch. The sharp click of the internal lock successfully blocked out the toxic noise, leaving the grand mansion bathed in absolute haunting silence. Her mind raced with terrifying clarity. The beautiful, comfortable life she thought she possessed was an incredibly complex, meticulously constructed lie entirely funded by her father and actively exploited by a malicious narcissist. She moved mechanically up the sweeping wooden staircase, her legs feeling incredibly heavy. She marched straight into their massive master bedroom and immediately pulled a large leather suitcase from the expansive walk-in closet. Her hands trembled violently as she began aggressively throwing her essential clothing and personal documents into the open luggage. She desperately needed to escape this poisonous environment and beg her father for absolute forgiveness. She zipped the heavy bag shut, turning sharply toward the bedroom door. Suddenly, the loud, aggressive sound of shattering glass echoed violently from the downstairs foyer. Brent had finally arrived back at the estate. He had been heavily drinking at a cheap downtown bar after his luxury Porsche was publicly repossessed. He stumbled aggressively into the lavish entryway, his expensive designer suit torn and reeking horribly of cheap alcohol. He was entirely unhinged, completely consumed by his utter financial destruction and profound social humiliation. Dominique stood frozen at the top of the landing, gripping the handle of her leather suitcase with white knuckles. Brent slowly lifted his bloodshot, chaotic eyes and locked onto the luggage resting by her trembling legs. His incredibly dark expression instantly morphed from drunken sorrow into sheer, calculating malice. He realized his pregnant wife, his absolute last remaining pawn in this vicious corporate war, was actively attempting to abandon him. He let out a dark, terrifying laugh that violently echoed off the high-vaulted ceilings. He completely snapped his toxic mind, finalizing a horrifying new strategy to regain his stolen power. Without breaking his intense, terrifying eye contact, Brent slowly reached backward behind his body. He grasped the heavy brass handle of the solid oak front door and aggressively engaged the internal deadbolt. He deliberately removed the metal key from the lock, sealing them both inside the massive luxury fortress. The ultimate safety net was officially completely severed. Dominique was now entirely trapped alone with a desperate, deeply dangerous monster perfectly today forever. Brent hurled the heavy brass key across the grand foyer, the metal striking the marble tiles with a sharp clatter that echoed through the trapped space. Dominique instinctively retreated, her spine pressing hard against the ornate wooden banister of the sweeping staircase. The man stalking toward her was completely unrecognizable. The polished, charming executive she had married was entirely gone, replaced by a sweating, erratic monster, reeking of cheap whiskey and utter financial desperation. Brent aggressively cornered her against the stairs, violently kicking her packed leather suitcase across the pristine floorboards. He loomed over her trembling frame, unleashing a torrential wave of venomous hatred. He viciously blamed Dominique and her low-life construction worker father for completely annihilating his glorious corporate legacy. In his deeply warped, intoxicated reality, he was the brilliant victim of a massive, coordinated conspiracy. He screamed that Waylon was a jealous, pathetic old man who had illegally manipulated the financial markets out of pure, unadulterated spite. Dominique squeezed her eyes tightly shut, desperately shielding her slightly swollen stomach with both arms. She refused to validate his psychotic delusions with a single word. Her absolute silence only fueled his rapidly escalating, uncontrollable rage. He slammed his heavy fists against the wooden banister on either side of her head, physically caging her against the polished mahogany. He leaned in incredibly close, his breath hot and toxic against her cheek. He snarled that she was a worthless, ungrateful burden who had actively plotted behind his back to destroy his massive corporate empire. He completely shifted from a calculating psychological abuser into a highly volatile, immediate physical threat. The dark, swirling chaos in his bloodshot eyes crossed a terrifying threshold. He violently pulled his right arm back, clenching his hand into a tight, trembling fist. He fully intended to strike his pregnant wife, entirely willing to inflict brutal physical damage to regain a fleeting, pathetic sense of control over his completely shattered universe. Dominique let out a sharp, terrified gasp, turning her face away and bracing for the devastating impact. The heavy silence of the grand mansion was suddenly broken, not by the sickening sound of physical violence, but by a deafening, explosive crash directly behind them. The violent eruption of splintering oak wood instantly stopped Brent in his tracks, freezing his raised fist perfectly suspended in the highly tense air today, exactly right now, at this fleeting moment, perfectly. The incredibly heavy, custom-solid oak front door violently shattered inward, completely ripping off its reinforced steel hinges and crashing brutally onto the marble floor. A massive cloud of thick wood dust instantly filled the grand foyer, temporarily obscuring the immediate entrance. As the heavy debris settled against the stone tiles, Waylon Freeman stepped calmly through the entirely destroyed doorway. He did not possess the frantic, desperate energy of a panicked father. He maintained the incredibly absolute, terrifying composure of a ruthless apex predator confidently executing a flawless surgical strike. He was seamlessly flanked by the exact same massive, highly trained private security contractors who had physically removed Brent earlier that exact morning. They were fully dressed in their immaculate black tactical gear, entirely ready to neutralize the immediate threat. Brent slowly turned his intoxicated head toward the enormous, ruined doorway, his raised fist still trembling violently in the humid air. The sheer visual impact of Waylon standing powerfully inside the seized property completely paralyzed Brent's shattered nervous system. He could not comprehend how the older man had successfully bypassed the locked estate gates and completely bypassed the advanced neighborhood security perimeter. Before Brent could even attempt to lower his aggressive arm or speak a single defensive word, Waylon issued a single incredibly silent nod directly toward his tactical team. The two massive guards lunged forward with terrifying explosive speed, closing the short distance across the marble floor in less than a fraction of a second. They struck Brent simultaneously, utilizing absolute, overwhelming physical force. The first contractor violently drove his heavy shoulder directly into Brent's ribcage, while the second agent aggressively grabbed his raised arm, twisting it sharply downward. Brent was violently tackled directly onto the hard marble floor, the heavy impact brutally knocking the remaining breath entirely from his lungs. The tactical contractors aggressively pinned his expensive torn suit jacket directly against the cold stone tiles. They violently wrenched his arms tightly behind his back, securely locking his wrists together with incredible pressure. Brent let out a pathetic muffled groan as his face was aggressively smashed flat against the pristine marble surface. He was utterly immobilized, completely subdued, and violently conquered within his own former sanctuary. Wayland slowly walked forward, his heavy work boots crunching loudly over the shattered oak splinters, firmly reclaiming absolute control over his daughter's life, perfectly, securely, completely, and permanently right here today forever. Wayland completely ignored the pathetic groaning man violently pinned to the cold marble floor. He stepped directly past the massive tactical guards and reached out his strong, calloused hands toward his terrified daughter. Dominique immediately collapsed entirely forward into his incredibly solid protective embrace. She wrapped her trembling arms tightly around his neck, burying her tear-stained face directly into the rough fabric of his faded flannel shirt. She wept with absolute uninhibited sorrow, finally releasing the massive, suffocating burden of the toxic illusion she had desperately defended for 3 long years. Wayland held her securely, gently stroking her hair with profound paternal tenderness. He completely shielded her fragile frame from the horrific, chaotic violence unfolding across the grand foyer. After a long, highly emotional moment, he slowly pulled back just enough to ensure she was physically unharmed. Once he confirmed her absolute safety, his warm expression instantly hardened back into sheer, terrifying ice. He slowly turned his intense, calculating gaze downward to observe the utterly defeated, disgraced executive lying helplessly at his heavy work boots. Brent was completely neutralized, his expensive designer suit hopelessly wrinkled and heavily stained with cold sweat. His left cheek remained aggressively smashed directly against the polished stone tiles beneath the immense crushing weight of the private security contractors. Brent stared up at the older African-American man, his bloodshot eyes entirely filled with pure, unadulterated terror and absolute subjugation. He could not move a single centimeter to defend his bruised, entirely shattered ego. Wayland stared down at the ruined narcissist, his expression radiating absolute, unwavering authority. He did not yell, boast, or gloat over his total corporate victory. Instead, he spoke with a quiet, incredibly sharp clarity that sliced directly through the tense, humid air. He firmly reminded Brent of the cruel, arrogant command issued inside the exclusive steakhouse just 24 hours ago. He calmly stated that Brent had viciously ordered him to lick his dinner directly off the filthy floor. Wayland coldly pointed out the supreme, devastating irony that Brent was now the pathetic creature violently forced to eat the floorboards. Just as the devastating sentence completely shattered Brent's remaining sanity, the loud, aggressive wail of approaching police sirens began echoing brightly through the wealthy suburban neighborhood. The swift, absolute consequences of Brent's massive corporate fraud and physical violence were officially arriving perfectly on time today, right now, forever, completely, permanently here. The harsh fluorescent lights of the pristine corporate boardroom illuminated the heavy mahogany table. Exactly 4 days had passed since the violent altercation at the suburban estate. Gallagher Innovations was officially holding a mandatory, highly classified emergency shareholder meeting. The spacious room was utterly silent, filled entirely with anxious junior executives and nervous legal clerks. The heavy double-glass doors swung open with aggressive force. Wayland Freeman strode confidently into the modern corporate sanctuary. He completely bypassed the guest seating and marched directly toward the massive leather chair positioned firmly at the absolute head of the long table. He sat down with profound authority, adjusting the cuffs of his bespoke charcoal suit. He had shed his faded flannel shirts, fully embracing his terrifying identity as the ruthless billionaire chairman of Apex Holdings. Moments later, the boardroom doors opened a second time. Brent stumbled into the quiet room, completely stripped of his former arrogant swagger. He had just been released from the municipal county jail on an incredibly high cash bail following his arrest for severe domestic assault. His face was deeply bruised, displaying a massive dark purple contusion sprawling across his left cheekbone, where the tactical security contractors had violently pinned him against the marble floor. His previously immaculate designer suit was severely wrinkled, hanging loosely over his visibly trembling, exhausted frame. Brent was legally compelled to attend this specific gathering. The strict corporate bylaws he had arrogantly signed 3 years ago mandated his physical presence for the ultimate dissolution of his own company. He slowly dragged his feet across the plush carpet, avoiding the intense, judgmental stares of his former subordinates. He pulled out a small plastic chair at the far end of the long table, collapsing into the cheap seat. He looked entirely broken, a pathetic shadow of the incredibly toxic narcissist who once ruled this entire office floor with absolute cruelty. Wayland stared directly down the length of the polished wood, his eyes reflecting pure, unadulterated ice. He did not offer a single word of greeting or false corporate politeness. He simply tapped his expensive fountain pen against the glass table exactly once. The sharp, singular sound instantly silenced the remaining murmurs in the room. The absolute execution of Brent's carefully constructed professional universe was officially commencing completely and permanently without a single ounce of mercy. Right now, perfectly today, inside this exact room forever, right here. Jonathan Reed stepped forward from the dark shadows of the far corner holding a massive stack of highly certified corporate legal documents. He distributed the thick packets to every single nervous executive seated around the expansive mahogany table. Wayland remained entirely seated, radiating incredible dominance as his chief attorney explicitly outlined the incredibly severe financial reality. Jonathan formally announced that a massive independent forensic audit had officially uncovered the exact staggering extent of Brent's reckless criminal embezzlement. The undeniably illicit diversion of vast corporate funds directly violated multiple federal financial statutes and entirely nullified his original executive contract. Wayland leaned forward, resting his powerful hands on the smooth glass surface. He coldly informed the completely silent room that he was actively executing a highly aggressive, deeply ruthless, hostile corporate takeover right now. He methodically explained that every single share of stock Brent had ever been granted was being forcefully liquidated immediately. The massive financial value of those seized assets would be directly utilized to completely cover the millions of dollars Brent had stolen to fund his illicit double life. Brent tried to quietly protest, weakly stammering a pathetic legal objection, but Jonathan instantly silenced him with a devastating glare. The attorney explicitly reminded the disgraced founder that he was currently facing incredibly severe federal imprisonment for his massive, undeniable financial crimes. Wayland then slowly shifted his intense, freezing gaze directly toward the 5 terrified men seated along the right side of the long table. These specific executives formed the entirely compliant, utterly useless puppet board of directors Brent had arrogantly installed to actively rubber stamp his incredibly reckless financial expenditures. Wayland did not tolerate absolute incompetence or deliberate corporate negligence. He brutally informed the 5 trembling men that they were completely and permanently terminated from Gallagher Innovations immediately. He explicitly ordered them to surrender their corporate keycards and vacate the towering building in less than 10 minutes. He coldly promised that if they ever attempted to secure employment within the financial sector again, Apex Holdings would personally ensure their professional reputations were entirely destroyed. The 5 disgraced directors immediately scrambled out of their expensive leather chairs in a state of absolute panic, practically running straight out of the tense boardroom. Wayland had surgically removed the absolute rot from the corporate structure in less than 15 minutes, leaving Brent entirely alone to perfectly face his total destruction right now, today, here. The massive boardroom was now completely empty, except for the 3 remaining men. Jonathan Reed stood silently by the heavy glass doors, his arms crossed over his chest like an immovable sentinel. Wayland remained seated at the absolute head of the long mahogany table, observing the utter destruction of his former adversary with a cold, unyielding gaze. Brent suddenly broke completely. The incredibly heavy, crushing reality of his absolute poverty and imminent federal imprisonment finally shattered his incredibly fragile ego. He violently slumped forward in his cheap plastic chair, burying his bruised, swollen face deep into his trembling hands. He began to weep loudly, producing ragged, incredibly pathetic sobs that echoed violently against the sterile walls of the corporate sanctuary. He practically fell to his bruised knees, aggressively crawling across the plush carpet toward Wayland's polished boots. He desperately begged the ruthless billionaire for a single ounce of basic human mercy. He wildly promised to sign completely over any remaining intellectual property, pleading with Wayland to generously grant him a minor financial severance package. He cried that his bank accounts were entirely frozen, his beautiful luxury cars were repossessed, and his pregnant wife had permanently locked him out of the suburban mansion. He shamefully admitted that he did not possess a single dollar to his name and desperately needed enough emergency cash simply to afford a cheap, filthy motel room for the incredibly cold night. Wayland did not express a single flicker of pity. He calmly raised his right hand, making a brief, highly calculated gesture toward the glass doors. The doors instantly swung open. A rugged, older African-American man wearing a faded blue custodial uniform stepped slowly into the quiet boardroom. He was the head janitor, a hard-working, incredibly humble man who had silently endured Brent's incredibly vicious daily verbal abuse for 3 entire years without a single complaint. Waylon nodded silently at the custodian. The older man walked purposefully toward the sobbing, disgraced executive kneeling desperately on the carpet. With profound, absolute dignity, the janitor abruptly released his grip on his heavy industrial equipment. A soaking wet mop and a large yellow bucket crashed violently onto the floor, splashing dirty, soapy water directly across Brent's incredibly expensive custom Italian leather shoes. Brent stared down at the filthy puddle in absolute horror. His ultimate corporate demotion was perfectly permanently finalized today, completely, exactly, securely, entirely right here now. The devastating news of the massive corporate embezzlement scandal detonated across the global financial sector the very next morning. Major financial news networks and prestigious business publications simultaneously published highly detailed exposés completely outlining Brent's spectacular, incredibly reckless downfall. The meticulously leaked forensic audit reports explicitly detailed every single stolen dollar, instantly transforming the once celebrated executive into a highly toxic radioactive pariah. His prestigious reputation was entirely incinerated overnight. Desperate to salvage his completely shattered life, Brent frantically dialed his extensive network of elite corporate allies, wealthy golf partners, and affluent country club associates. Every single call was immediately sent to automated voicemail. His numbers were permanently blocked across the entire metropolitan high society. No legitimate financial institution would even allow him past their lobby security desks, let alone grant him a professional interview. The crushing reality of absolute poverty violently suffocated him. He was completely locked out of his frozen bank accounts and entirely evicted from his luxurious lifestyle. His designer suits grew increasingly dirty and wrinkled as he spent his miserable days wandering the unforgiving city streets. Driven by sheer agonizing hunger and absolute desperation, Brent made an incredibly dangerous, highly irreversible decision. He abandoned the gleaming financial district and actively sought out deeply shady, highly dangerous street lenders operating in the darkest, most violent corners of the criminal underworld. He desperately secured a small predatory cash loan featuring an astronomically high, entirely illegal interest rate just to afford incredibly cheap, highly processed fast food and a filthy, roach-infested motel room for the week. The ruthless loan sharks did not care about his former corporate glory or his pending federal criminal charges. They only cared about absolute compliance and immediate weekly cash repayments. Brent foolishly believed he could quickly outsmart these violent criminals, desperately hoping he could somehow gamble or manipulate the borrowed cash into a miraculous financial recovery. He completely failed to understand that he had just willingly surrendered his absolute physical safety to incredibly brutal men who utilized severe physical violence to aggressively enforce their strict payment schedules. He was no longer a wealthy predator hunting in the corporate boardroom. He had willingly reduced himself to absolute prey, completely trapped at the absolute bottom of the unforgiving urban food chain. This harsh new reality was an entirely permanent, highly inescapable nightmare meticulously designed by his own unparalleled, incredibly arrogant greed right here today, perfectly. Waylon observed Brent's incredibly rapid, highly pathetic descent into the dangerous criminal underworld from a perfectly safe, entirely insulated distance. His massive private security network continuously monitored the disgraced executive's every single desperate movement, delivering highly detailed daily reports directly to the billionaire's polished desk. Waylon did not feel a single microscopic shred of pity for the ruined narcissist currently sleeping inside a filthy, roach-infested motel room. His protective, fatherly focus remained entirely dedicated to securing the absolute permanent safety of his beloved daughter and his precious unborn grandchild. He confidently scheduled a highly confidential, urgent morning meeting with Jonathan Reed at the prestigious downtown legal headquarters. Waylon marched directly into the expansive corner office, immediately instructing his brilliant chief attorney to swiftly draft an incredibly aggressive, completely impenetrable financial instrument. He explicitly demanded the immediate creation of an ironclad, independent trust fund, exclusively designating Dominique and the baby as the sole permanent beneficiaries. Waylon methodically transferred an absolutely staggering, completely untraceable sum of pure liquid capital directly into the newly established, heavily guarded offshore account. He absolutely refused to leave any potential legal loophole vulnerable to future corporate exploitation or manipulative marital claims. He calculatingly dictated incredibly strict, ruthlessly precise legal stipulations, explicitly guaranteeing that no man could ever legally touch the massive principal balance. The highly complex contractual language permanently blocked Brent from ever attempting to access or seize the immense generational wealth, even through incredibly deceptive proxy lawsuits or prolonged divorce court litigation. Jonathan meticulously typed every single ironclad mandate, perfectly translating Wayland's fierce protective instincts into an absolutely terrifying, unbreakable legal fortress. The formidable attorney officially notarized the incredibly thick stack of binding documents, firmly assuring the billionaire that Dominique's immense financial independence was now entirely permanently secured against any possible future corporate predators. Wayland signed the final signature line with incredibly steady, powerful hands, officially sealing the unbreakable corporate vault forever. He had successfully transformed his massive business empire into an incredibly lethal protective shield, perfectly ensuring his family would never again fall victim to a manipulative, financially abusive monster. He slowly stood up from the heavy leather chair, buttoning his bespoke suit jacket with absolute terrifying composure. The comprehensive financial protection protocol was officially entirely activated, leaving him completely free to patiently await the inevitable, highly destructive final act of Brent's spectacularly disastrous, incredibly pathetic criminal downfall right now, securely, safely, permanently here. A brutal, incredibly violent rainstorm relentlessly lashed the quiet suburban neighborhood late that evening. Massive sheets of freezing rainwater aggressively hammered against the heavy glass windows of Wayland's comfortable, warmly lit residence. The billionaire sat quietly inside his plush leather armchair, peacefully reading a thick financial dossier, while the chaotic weather raged furiously outside. Dominique was resting completely safely upstairs, entirely shielded from the terrifying, disastrous consequences currently destroying her abusive husband's rapidly shrinking universe. Suddenly, the tranquil, insulated silence of the massive house was violently interrupted. Wayland heard a frantic, incredibly desperate knocking echoing loudly from the solid oak front door. The frantic pounding grew progressively louder, completely saturated with absolute pathetic panic. Wayland slowly closed his reading folder, placing it gently onto the smooth glass coffee table. He calmly stood up from his comfortable chair, projecting sheer, utterly unshakable composure as he methodically walked toward the grand foyer. He did not rush deliberately, allowing the frantic intruder to aggressively stew in his own miserable, suffocating terror. Wayland unlocked the heavy brass deadbolt, pulling the thick wooden door slowly inward to reveal the absolute, utter wreckage of a formerly arrogant executive. Brent stood completely shivering on the freezing, rain-slicked porch, entirely soaked to the absolute bone. His once immaculate, incredibly expensive designer suit was entirely ruined, completely saturated with freezing mud and filthy street water. His face was a horrific, deeply bruised mask of pure physical agony. A massive, incredibly dark purple black eye completely swelled his left socket shut, serving as brutal, undeniable evidence of the extremely violent, unforgiving street lenders he had foolishly attempted to desperately manipulate. Blood slowly trickled down his trembling chin, washing away into the freezing, relentless downpour. Brent's arrogant, utterly toxic corporate swagger was completely, permanently vaporized. He clutched his shivering, heavily bruised ribs, practically collapsing forward against the heavy wooden doorframe. He looked up at the incredibly powerful stoic billionaire with absolutely pathetic, entirely shattered desperation. He was completely stripped of his stolen wealth, his false corporate prestige, and his incredibly dangerous manipulative charm. Wayland stood perfectly still inside the warm, brightly lit foyer, staring directly down at the deeply pathetic, entirely ruined monster shivering helplessly on his wet welcome mat. The ultimate devastating conclusion to Brent's massively toxic, highly destructive corporate reign of terror had officially permanently arrived right here, exactly today, immediately, completely, forever, entirely, permanently, right safely now. Brent's bruised knees hit the freezing concrete of the porch with a sickening thud. The sheer physical impact barely registered through his absolute shivering desperation. He stared up at the formidable billionaire, the relentless rain plastering his ruined hair across his severely swollen forehead. The arrogant corporate predator was entirely gone, replaced by a pathetic whining shell desperately grasping for a final lifeline. He completely abandoned any remaining shred of dignity, openly weeping as the freezing water violently washed the blood down his trembling neck. He launched into a frantic, meticulously rehearsed monologue, actively attempting to play the ultimate victim card. He loudly blamed the immense, crushing societal pressure of modern corporate culture for his massive financial embezzlement. He frantically claimed that the high-stakes startup environment had entirely warped his judgment, forcing him to make incredibly reckless decisions simply to maintain the impossible image of success. He shifted his toxic narrative aggressively, blaming the extreme stress of marrying into the formidable Freeman family. He wept that he constantly felt incredibly inadequate compared to Wayland's massive, intimidating legacy, claiming his deep insecurities had driven him straight into the waiting arms of his expensive mistress. He completely refused to accept any genuine personal accountability, explicitly painting himself as a tragic, misunderstood casualty of a ruthless capitalist system. Wayland stood perfectly still inside the warm, dry foyer, his facial expression remaining utterly unchanged as he silently absorbed the incredibly pathetic performance. Brent stretched out his trembling, freezing hands, his swollen eyes begging for absolute mercy. He completely dropped the grand corporate demands, pathetically asking for a tiny, insignificant cash loan. He frantically explained that the violent street lenders were actively hunting him down, explicitly threatening his physical safety if he did not produce immediate cash. He begged Wayland for just enough money to purchase a cheap bus ticket and completely flee the entire state by morning. He promised to vanish entirely from Dominique's life, vowing to never contact the family again if Wayland would simply grant him this one final, incredibly minor financial favor. The freezing rain continued, lashing against his ruined designer suit, perfectly framing the absolute spectacular ruin of a man who had completely destroyed his own universe. He actively pleaded for absolute salvation, completely unwilling to face the massive, incredibly brutal, and highly dangerous consequences of his pure, unadulterated, entirely selfish greed right now, today, right here, perfectly forever. Wayland stared directly down at the utterly broken man groveling pathetically on his wet porch. He did not display a single microscopic ounce of pity, nor did his expression reveal any lingering trace of burning anger. He had entirely moved past the turbulent emotions of pure outrage and betrayal, settling into an absolute freezing state of permanent indifference. The incredibly massive, highly impenetrable boundary he had established to protect his beloved daughter was now officially set in solid stone. He simply observed Brent as a completely neutralized threat, an entirely irrelevant toxic variable, permanently removed from the comprehensive corporate and familial equation. Brent continued sobbing wildly into the freezing rain, his desperate pleas for emergency cash echoing pitifully against the solid brick columns of the luxurious estate. He violently shivered, his incredibly dark, severe bruising starkly highlighting the massive physical consequences of his incredibly arrogant choices. Wayland calmly placed his powerful, calloused right hand directly onto the heavy brass knob of the shattered, subsequently replaced front door. He looked straight into Brent's swollen, bloodshot eyes, completely freezing the frantic, shivering executive with his sheer, unyielding authority. The relentless downpour violently lashed the surrounding manicured landscaping, entirely masking the distant sounds of the wealthy suburban neighborhood. Wayland finally broke his long, absolute silence, speaking with an incredibly low, perfectly clear baritone voice that effortlessly, completely dominated the chaotic, violent weather. He methodically addressed the ruined narcissist, totally dismantling the entirely fabricated victim narrative Brent had just desperately spun. He stated clearly that nobody else had forced Brent to recklessly embezzle millions in corporate funds, relentlessly pursue a secret mistress, or viciously attempt to legally imprison a perfectly sane man inside a heavily guarded psychiatric ward. Wayland firmly declared that Brent was the absolute sole architect of his entire monumental destruction. He looked down at the miserable, trembling figure and delivered the absolute final corporate verdict with chilling, unwavering precision. "You dug your own grave. I simply stopped paying for the shovel." The devastatingly precise, incredibly sharp words struck Brent like a massive, undeniable physical blow directly to the chest, instantly silencing his frantic, pathetic weeping right now entirely. Wayland maintained absolute, terrifying eye contact for one final, incredibly heavy second, permanently sealing the massive, impenetrable wall directly between his fiercely protected family and the absolute total ruin of a completely disgraced monster forever. Today, perfectly, securely, completely, exactly right here now. Without waiting for a single additional response from the shivering, utterly defeated man, Wayland slowly and deliberately pulled the heavy oak door backward. The thick, incredibly solid wood glided smoothly across the grand marble threshold, functioning as the absolute final barrier permanently separating Brent from his stolen, unearned paradise. The metallic click of the heavy brass deadbolt aggressively snapping into place echoed loudly through the humid air, definitively locking the disgraced corporate executive outside in the freezing, relentless downpour. Brent was entirely cut off, instantly plunged into complete suffocating darkness as the warm exterior porch lights were sharply extinguished from within. He immediately collapsed entirely onto his bruising knees, throwing his head backward toward the punishing, stormy sky. He unleashed a massive, incredibly raw scream of pure, absolute agony, wildly vocalizing his sheer, terrifying realization of his monumental, completely irreversible destruction. His desperate, furious cries were entirely swallowed by the violent, roaring thunder completely ignored by the vast, wealthy suburban neighborhood he had once so proudly claimed to rule. He remained stranded on the freezing concrete for hours, violently shivering, until sheer physical exhaustion finally forced his broken body to miserably retreat into the unforgiving urban shadows. The dark, stormy night eventually transitioned into a bleak, heavily overcast morning completely devoid of any remaining warmth or corporate mercy. Sunlight struggled desperately to pierce the thick, gloomy clouds hanging low over the filthy, roach-infested downtown sector. Brent lay trembling inside a cheap, highly unsanitary motel room, his heavily bruised face resting against a stained, deeply foul mattress. His entirely depleted bank accounts and absolutely terrifying street debts had finally reached their absolute, highly dangerous climax. He stared vacantly at the peeling, water-damaged wallpaper, completely paralyzed by sheer, unadulterated fear. Suddenly, the chaotic, immensely loud wail of approaching emergency sirens violently shattered the miserable, depressing silence of the narrow, trash-filled alleyway directly behind his single window. The incredibly intense, blinding flash of rotating blue and red lights aggressively pierced the thin, filthy curtains, rapidly painting the tiny, disgusting room in highly urgent, chaotic colors. He violently scrambled backward against the rotting headboard, frantically realizing his criminal deception had nowhere left to hide today. The harsh, incredibly aggressive sound of heavily armed law enforcement vehicles aggressively surrounding the perimeter instantly signaled the absolute permanent conclusion to his massive, incredibly destructive corporate fraud, completely right here, precisely today, now, forever, perfectly. The flimsy wooden door of the cheap downtown motel instantly splintered inward under the massive, synchronized force of a heavily armed federal tactical unit. Brent violently recoiled against the rotting headboard, his bruised hands instinctively flying upward to shield his swollen face from the blinding, highly aggressive beams of tactical flashlights aggressively piercing the dark, filthy room. Dozens of federal agents stormed the incredibly cramped space, their commanding voices entirely drowning out the relentless morning rain drumming against the cracked window pane. An imposing lead investigator stepped sharply through the ruined doorway, formally declaring Brent officially under arrest for massive federal wire fraud, severe corporate embezzlement, and highly illegal financial extortion. The heavily armored agents violently wrenched Brent's arms securely behind his back, securely locking heavy steel handcuffs around his trembling wrists. The disgraced corporate executive did not offer a single word of arrogant defiance or pathetic bargaining. The absolute crushing finality of the devastating federal raid completely paralyzed his vocal cords. He was aggressively hauled out of the miserable roach-infested room and forcefully shoved into the back of a waiting armored transport vehicle, officially disappearing entirely into the unforgiving, relentless grip of the federal justice system. Miles away from the chaotic downtown sector, the absolute tranquility of the sprawling suburban estate stood in incredibly stark, beautiful contrast. Dominique sat quietly at the massive granite kitchen island, her hands wrapped tightly around a smooth ceramic mug. The pristine, sunlit kitchen felt entirely insulated from the horrific, toxic nightmare she had narrowly escaped just hours prior. Her exhausted eyes remained locked directly onto a small television screen resting quietly on the marble counter. The breaking morning news broadcast was actively displaying the incredibly frantic, highly chaotic footage of her husband being violently marched out of the filthy alleyway in federal custody. The sleek, highly polished anchor professionally detailed the staggering multi-million-dollar financial crimes Brent had meticulously orchestrated over the past 3 years. Dominique watched the pathetic, completely ruined man on the glowing screen with absolute chilling detachment. The charming, sophisticated executive she had foolishly trusted with her entire life was completely gone, definitively exposed as a deeply malicious, profoundly dangerous criminal predator. The horrific illusion of her perfect marriage was now officially entirely eradicated and permanently destroyed. She calmly pressed the black power button on the television remote, instantly plunging the small glowing screen into absolute unforgiving darkness forever. Dominique slowly lowered the plastic remote onto the pristine granite counter, the absolute finality of the televised broadcast breaking the last remaining barrier within her shattered soul. A sudden, massive wave of overwhelming emotional devastation crashed violently over her exhausted frame. She completely collapsed forward against the smooth kitchen island, burying her face deeply into her trembling hands as profound, uncontrollable sobs aggressively racked her pregnant body. Waylon stepped silently into the bright sunlit room, his heavy work boots gliding softly across the polished hardwood floor. He did not immediately speak or offer empty, meaningless comfort. He simply pulled out a tall wooden bar stool and sat down heavily beside his deeply traumatized daughter. Dominique lifted her swollen, tear-stained face, staring directly into the warm, fiercely protective eyes of the incredible man she had foolishly pushed away. Her voice cracked violently as she frantically poured out an incredibly raw, deeply agonizing apology. She vehemently begged for his absolute forgiveness, openly weeping as she thoroughly confessed her monumental, deeply humiliating mistakes. She cried that the intoxicating manufactured illusion of perfect romantic love had completely blinded her to Brent's inherently toxic, profoundly malicious nature. She viciously condemned her own pathetic cowardice, sobbing relentlessly over the undeniable fact that she had actively stood by in complete complicit silence while a vicious monster continuously disrespected, belittled, and completely humiliated her own loving father. She explicitly recalled the horrific, devastating dinner at the exclusive downtown steakhouse, aggressively hating herself for allowing Brent to ruthlessly command Waylon to practically eat directly off the filthy restaurant floor. Dominique clutched Waylon's strong, calloused hand with absolute terrifying desperation, completely shattering under the immense crushing guilt of her prolonged, deeply enabling blindness. She wept that she had willingly traded her profound family loyalty for an incredibly cheap, incredibly toxic corporate fairy tale perfectly designed by a ruthless, unredeemable narcissist. She repeatedly begged Waylon to somehow permanently forgive her massive, entirely unjustifiable failures. Waylon simply sat there radiating absolute, unwavering paternal strength as he listened to every single heartbreaking, agonizing word perfectly spilling from her trembling lips. He gently squeezed her fragile fingers, actively absorbing the incredible crushing magnitude of her profound emotional agony without a single ounce of harsh judgment or lingering resentment. He knew her pain was entirely genuine, and his heart physically ached watching his precious child suffer this dark, necessary awakening perfectly right here now, today, forever. Waylon slowly stood up from the heavy wooden bar stool, his massive presence providing an incredibly reassuring, deeply grounded anchor within the highly emotional space. He quietly walked over to the gleaming stainless steel stove, methodically preparing a warm, incredibly soothing cup of herbal tea. He gently placed the steaming ceramic mug directly in front of his weeping daughter, allowing the fragrant, calming aroma to slowly permeate the tense kitchen air. He sat back down, leaning his muscular forearms heavily onto the pristine granite counter. Waylon looked directly into Dominique's tearful eyes, his incredibly rich, deep voice resonating with profound, hard-earned wisdom. He calmly explained that extreme, unadulterated wealth was never an impenetrable magical shield against human cruelty or profound emotional suffering. He firmly stated that massive financial power merely acts as an incredibly powerful, highly revealing magnifying glass, instantly exposing and aggressively amplifying the absolute, undeniable true character of every single individual it inevitably touches. He quietly reminded her that Brent's inherent, deeply toxic flaws were not originally created by the massive corporate money, but rather violently unleashed by its intoxicating, highly corrupting influence. Waylon then took a deep, incredibly heavy breath, deliberately shifting the profound conversation toward his own deeply guarded, highly secretive past. He softly admitted that he actively carried a massive, undeniable share of the terrible blame for her incredibly painful, highly traumatic marital experience. He humbly confessed that by relentlessly purposefully hiding his true immense billionaire status and portraying himself merely as a simple, struggling blue-collar worker, he had inadvertently left her completely exposed and severely vulnerable to dangerous, highly manipulative social climbers. He quietly explained his original, deeply misguided intention was strictly to protect her from the shallow, inherently toxic greed that constantly infected the elite corporate world. He sincerely apologized for inadvertently creating a massive, highly dangerous blind spot within her incredibly trusting heart. Dominique listened to his profound, deeply vulnerable confession, her violent, agonizing sobs slowly transitioning into soft, highly restorative tears of absolute, undeniable clarity. The massive, deeply toxic shadow Brent had viciously cast over their entire familial relationship was officially entirely eradicated. Waylon reached across the cold stone island, pulling her gently into an incredibly warm, fiercely protective embrace. They were finally completely, genuinely united. Their unbreakable, highly resilient bond, permanently fortified against any future threats, perfectly securely, entirely forever here today, right now, always completely and absolutely eternally. Segment 19.1. The Rejection of Money. The morning sun cast long shadows across the polished granite kitchen island as the emotional storm finally passed. Waylon slowly withdrew from their embrace and reached inside his tailored suit jacket. He produced a thick, heavily notarized legal portfolio and slid it gently across the cold stone surface toward Dominique. He explained in a calm, incredibly steady voice that Jonathan Reed had successfully established an impenetrable, massive offshore trust fund entirely in her name. He explicitly detailed the absolute legal protections surrounding the staggering generational wealth, ensuring her and her unborn child would never face financial vulnerability again. He offered her total, unadulterated freedom from the devastating poverty Brent had threatened. Dominique stared down at the crisp, legal documents, her tearful eyes scanning the magnificent numbers printed boldly across the premium paper. Slowly, she pushed the heavy portfolio back across the granite island. She looked directly into her father's surprised face and firmly refused the immense fortune. She spoke with a newfound crystalline clarity that entirely lacked her previous fragility. She explained that accepting another massive financial safety net would simply replace one gilded cage with another. The intoxicating illusion of unearned luxury had completely blinded her to Brent's monstrous manipulation, and she entirely refused to repeat that devastating mistake. She needed to forge her own undeniable strength. Dominique proudly announced her immediate intention to return to the prestigious state university and officially complete her abandoned law degree. She explicitly stated her burning desire to study corporate litigation, vowing to thoroughly understand the exact legal mechanisms predators like Brent utilize to exploit innocent victims. She completely rejected the passive role of a wealthy heiress, fiercely declaring her absolute need to build her own impenetrable intellectual armor. She wanted to earn her survival, meticulously constructing a career that would allow her to actively protect herself and her child without relying on massive inherited wealth. Waylon listened to her fierce declaration, a profound, undeniable sense of absolute pride swelling deeply within his chest. He saw the incredible raw determination burning brightly in her eyes, instantly recognizing his own relentless work ethic perfectly mirrored in his daughter. He slowly nodded his head completely, accepting her powerful decision. He quietly promised to support her academic journey entirely, absolutely thrilled that the incredibly painful destruction of her toxic marriage had successfully forged a remarkably independent, fiercely resilient woman right here today, completely, forever, right now. Segment 19.2. The Charity Gala. Exactly 6 full months rapidly passed since the highly destructive corporate purge completely eradicated Brent from high society. The incredibly prestigious grand ballroom of the magnificent downtown Plaza Hotel was utterly transformed into an absolute breathtaking spectacle. The wealthiest elite billionaires across the entire thriving metropolis gathered eagerly tonight for the most exclusive annual charity gala. Gleaming crystal chandeliers cast warm golden light directly over hundreds of incredibly arrogant executives sipping highly expensive vintage champagne. They casually traded incredibly toxic rumors regarding the massive vacant power vacuum currently plaguing the highly competitive financial district. Suddenly, the massive ornate double doors at the main entrance swung smoothly open. The incredibly loud ambient chatter entirely died within mere seconds. Waylon Freeman confidently stepped across the grand velvet threshold, entirely commanding the massive room. He was completely unrecognizable from the struggling blue-collar worker he previously portrayed. He completely abandoned his faded flannel shirts and heavily scuffed work boots forever. Tonight, he wore a flawlessly tailored custom black tuxedo that perfectly accentuated his formidable, powerful frame. He moved with the terrifying, undeniable authority of an absolute apex predator, completely dominating his natural corporate environment. The massive crowd of arrogant socialites violently parted directly down the center, forming an incredibly wide, incredibly silent path completely out of sheer, unadulterated shock. Waylon slowly walked forward, radiating pure, highly concentrated financial power. The incredibly prestigious event organizers immediately rushed forward, formally introducing the intimidating African-American billionaire as the absolute primary benefactor, entirely funding the massive charitable foundation tonight. The incredibly wealthy executives completely froze, dropping their expensive crystal glasses in absolute terrifying disbelief. They instantly recognized the incredibly quiet, humble janitor they previously maliciously mocked inside exclusive steakhouse lobbies. They completely realized with sickening, undeniable clarity that they had actively insulted the single most powerful financial titan entirely operating within their pristine city limits. Waylon absolutely ignored their pathetic, trembling stares, completely refusing to validate their massive, sudden panic with a single glance. He calmly approached the absolute center of the vast, beautiful ballroom, effortlessly claiming his rightful position at the absolute pinnacle of their exclusive, highly guarded hierarchy. He stood tall before the gathered crowd, entirely unbothered by the terrified whispers spreading wildly across the opulent room. His undeniable victory was firmly secured right here today, perfectly establishing his incredible legacy without a single flaw ever again, forever now. Segment 19.3. The Approaching Threat. The incredibly powerful billionaire stood flawlessly beneath the magnificent glowing chandeliers, entirely commanding absolute respect from every single attendee. The exact same wealthy corporate men who previously laughed maliciously at his filthy blue uniform inside the exclusive downtown restaurant now actively bowed their heads in pure, total submission. They practically stumbled over their expensive polished shoes, frantically attempting to offer incredibly pathetic fawning apologies for their incredibly vicious past transgressions. Waylon simply observed their severe, desperate panic with cool, unyielding detachment, completely refusing to verbally acknowledge their extremely pathetic existence. He slowly turned his formidable gaze directly toward the grand crystal staircase, preparing to gracefully exit the incredibly crowded, chaotic ballroom. Suddenly, a highly abrasive, incredibly loud voice violently pierced the respectful ambient silence immediately surrounding the powerful titan. An incredibly arrogant, aggressively dressed young tech executive stepped violently directly into Waylon's personal path, completely blocking his intended exit route. The incredibly foolish young man possessed an entirely unearned swagger, wearing an incredibly tight custom suit perfectly tailored to explicitly flaunt his massive, overwhelming corporate ego. He completely ignored fundamental social boundaries, aggressively thrusting a thick, glossy presentation folder directly toward Waylon's imposing chest. He incredibly loudly demanded immediate massive financial funding for a highly speculative, highly risky new software venture, explicitly framing his reckless pitch as an incredibly massive, unmissable favor to Apex Holdings. The incredibly dense surrounding crowd completely gasped in pure, unadulterated terror, rapidly stepping backward to entirely avoid the impending catastrophic corporate execution. Waylon remained completely, perfectly still, staring directly into the highly aggressive, entitled eyes of the foolish young man currently invading his incredibly secure personal space. A slow, incredibly dark smile gradually spread across Waylon's completely stoic, powerful face. He did not immediately unleash his incredibly devastating financial wrath upon the incredibly pathetic, arrogant intruder. Instead, he simply stared directly through the loud, obnoxious executive, actively seeing the terrifying, miserable ghost of Brent, perfectly reincarnated, standing directly before him right now. The incredibly toxic cycle of absolute blind corporate greed completely refused to permanently die, continuing to continuously generate incredibly desperate, highly manipulative predators, relentlessly hunting for incredibly massive unearned wealth. Wayland quietly accepted the incredibly challenging, undeniable reality, entirely preparing his massive, incredibly lethal legal fortress for another totally spectacular, absolutely devastating, complete corporate annihilation, flawlessly commencing immediately tomorrow morning, right here today, forever perfectly resolved, entirely, permanently, completely secure and solid now. Wayland stood absolutely motionless beneath the brilliant cascading crystal chandeliers, radiating an impenetrable aura of sheer financial dominance. The obnoxious young tech executive continued aggressively waving the glossy presentation folder directly inches from Wayland's tailored tuxedo jacket, loudly demanding immediate millions for his highly speculative software venture. The abrasive intruder completely failed to recognize the immense danger he was actively inviting, entirely blinded by the exact same toxic arrogance that had spectacularly destroyed Brent. Wayland did not offer a single word of argument, nor did he allow his facial expression to shift into visible anger. He simply observed the frantic, pathetic performance with absolute freezing indifference. The incredibly tense surrounding crowd held their collective breath, desperately anticipating a massive, violently loud corporate execution right there inside the prestigious grand ballroom. Instead, Wayland completely bypassed the expected dramatic confrontation. He calmly shifted his formidable gaze slightly over the arrogant young man's shoulder, making one incredibly brief, virtually microscopic nod toward the heavy mahogany doors. The highly trained, incredibly elite private security contractors completely understood the silent, absolute directive instantly. Two massive, impeccably dressed security agents materialized silently from the surrounding shadows, completely flanking the foolish executive in less than 3 seconds. They smoothly and incredibly firmly gripped the young man's custom suit jacket, expertly clamping his flailing arms directly against his sides with terrifying, unyielding physical precision. The abrasive intruder attempted to sputter a final highly indignant protest, but the seasoned agents immediately neutralized his voice with swift, suffocating pressure. They aggressively marched the struggling, entirely humiliated executive backward across the polished marble floor, completely bypassing the main guest entrance. They forcefully escorted him straight through a highly discreet side service door, instantly vanishing into the cold urban night. The entire surgical removal lasted exactly 15 seconds. The massive, deeply offensive problem was entirely handled smoothly, cleanly, and completely without a single raised voice disrupting the elegant atmosphere. Wayland smoothly adjusted his pristine cuffs, his terrifyingly calm demeanor remaining entirely unshaken by the pathetic interruption. The terrified elite guests actively scrambled backward, completely realizing the absolute undeniable magnitude of Wayland's silent power. He did not need to scream or financially threaten his enemies to command absolute respect. He completely controlled the entire metropolitan hierarchy with a single devastatingly silent gesture, officially cementing his terrifying, highly impenetrable corporate reign entirely perfectly forever right here today, securely now forever perfectly today, absolutely permanently. Exactly 2 entire years rapidly evaporated since the spectacular, absolutely permanent financial annihilation of the deeply toxic corporate predator. The massive, brightly lit downtown offices of Dominique's newly established legal clinic proudly opened their heavy glass doors to the public. She had successfully utilized her newly earned, highly prestigious law degree to actively create a powerful, completely impenetrable sanctuary explicitly designed for severe financial abuse survivors. She confidently strode across the pristine reception area, radiating absolute, undeniable strength and incredibly fierce independence. Dominique no longer required a massive, secretive offshore trust fund to ensure her absolute personal safety. She had meticulously forged her own incredibly durable, highly effective intellectual armor, actively transforming her profound marital trauma into a powerful, deeply impactful legal crusade. She vigorously defended extremely vulnerable clients, expertly dismantling incredibly vicious, manipulative spouses with ruthless, terrifying courtroom precision. Her massive, highly dedicated legal team continuously completely crushed arrogant abusers, perfectly echoing the exact same unyielding, formidable justice her incredible father naturally embodied. hundreds of miles away from her gleaming, highly successful corporate headquarters, an incredibly stark, entirely depressing reality relentlessly unfolded. The harsh, deeply unforgiving fluorescent lights of a maximum security federal penitentiary violently illuminated the damp, incredibly foul-smelling prison laundry room. Brent slowly dragged his exhausted, heavily bruised feet across the slick, severely stained concrete floor. He was currently miserably serving the highly agonizing second year of a massive, completely inescapable 2-decade federal sentence. The formerly arrogant, incredibly wealthy corporate executive was now permanently reduced to a pathetic, completely anonymous inmate, strictly following incredibly rigid, highly aggressive penal routines. He wore a deeply faded, immensely oversized orange prison jumpsuit, his once immaculate appearance permanently replaced by a hollow, terrifyingly gaunt physical frame. Brent aggressively shoved heavy, soaking wet prison linens directly into a massive, incredibly loud industrial washing machine. His blistered, severely calloused hands violently ached with every single repetitive, highly exhausting motion. He possessed absolutely no remaining wealth, no hidden corporate leverage, and zero highly influential social connections. The incredibly brutal, deeply isolating reality of his massive, highly deserved federal punishment entirely consumed his incredibly pathetic, permanently ruined existence. Dominique passionately built an incredibly vibrant, fiercely protective empire entirely dedicated to pure, absolute justice, while Brent hopelessly drowned inside a completely dark, permanently inescapable concrete cage exactly today. Right here forever now, perfectly, securely, entirely, completely, always, absolutely, permanently, perfectly, safely, completely, right now. Far removed from the incredibly loud, highly chaotic financial battlegrounds of the massive downtown district, Waylon Freeman finally returned to the absolute, unwavering peace of his expansive suburban estate. The incredibly quiet, highly insulated evening air completely enveloped the massive property, perfectly shielding the formidable billionaire from the relentless, demanding corporate universe. He slowly opened the heavy wooden door leading directly into his massive, immaculately organized private workshop garage. The incredibly rich, deeply comforting aroma of freshly cut pine wood instantly filled his powerful lungs, immediately grounding his highly active, intensely strategic mind. The massive, gleaming corporate headquarters he completely dominated daily felt incredibly distant, entirely replaced by the simple, profoundly honest reality of his personal sanctuary. He slowly removed his highly expensive, flawlessly tailored tuxedo jacket, carefully draping the incredibly fine fabric over a sturdy wooden workbench. Waylon calmly rolled up the crisp, bright white sleeves of his premium dress shirt, deliberately exposing his massively thick, heavily calloused forearms. He did not immediately reach for a complex financial dossier or an expensive mobile device. Instead, he simply reached into the far corner of the quiet workshop and firmly gripped a standard, incredibly ordinary wooden push broom. He methodically began to sweep the fine, golden sawdust directly across the smooth concrete floor, his incredibly powerful, highly calculated movements echoing with absolute, undeniable rhythmic precision. He successfully managed an incredibly vast, completely unstoppable billion-dollar global empire, expertly commanding thousands of highly ambitious corporate executives with absolute terrifying authority. Yet the formidable titan actively discovered his absolute truest sense of pure, unadulterated internal peace strictly right here, quietly sweeping absolute dirt off his own private garage floor. Waylon slowly gathered the accumulated sawdust into a perfectly neat, highly precise mound. He inherently understood the incredibly profound, utterly unshakable truth governing his entire massive existence. Absolute ultimate corporate power did not genuinely consist of aggressively forcing another broken, entirely defeated man to violently lick a filthy marble floor in sheer pathetic submission. True, highly authentic, entirely unbreakable ultimate power was simply possessing the absolute quiet, incredibly immense internal pride to peacefully clean your own floor entirely by yourself without a single ounce of hesitation. He gently rested the heavy broom perfectly against the solid brick wall, his massive, incredibly protective empire completely, permanently secured forever. Right here, exactly, perfectly, safely, absolutely, eternally today, completely, flawlessly, securely, immensely, permanently, completely, entirely right now. This story ultimately reveals a profound truth regarding the intoxicating, dangerous nature of extreme wealth and power. Financial dominance frequently acts merely as a highly polished mirror, instantly exposing and actively amplifying our deepest, most inherent character flaws. True strength never relies on maliciously humiliating your adversaries or ruthlessly crushing those who are profoundly vulnerable. Authentic, enduring power is quietly discovered through absolute humility, fierce familial protection, and the unyielding pride of maintaining your own personal sanctuary. Wealth can rapidly vanish, but unshakable personal integrity remains entirely permanent. Please subscribe, like this video, and share your incredible thoughts below today.